The widow took one look at Caleb Thorne stepping off that train, 6'7" of hope wrapped in worn wool, and her face twisted like she'd bitten into spoiled fruit. "You didn't mention you were a giant," she spat, loud enough for the whole platform to hear. Laughter rippled through the crowd as her carriage wheels cut fresh tracks through the snow, leaving him stranded in a town that didn't want him. But rejection has a way of leading us exactly where we're meant to be. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train's whistle died in the mountain wind, and with it, the last of Caleb Thorne's carefully constructed hope. He stood on the platform of Willow Bend Station, his traveling bag gripped in hands that had known more calluses than kindness, watching the woman who was supposed to be his future disappear into the white haze of a February afternoon. The snow fell in thick, careless sheets, the kind that buried mistakes and expectations alike. Margaret Whitmore hadn't even let him speak. She'd taken one sweeping glance from his scuffed boots to the top of his head, a journey that required her to crane her neck back farther than dignity apparently allowed, and her expression had curdled. The lavender-scented letters she'd sent east over 6 months, each one more encouraging than the last, might as well have been written by a different woman. Or perhaps they had been written by a different woman, one who existed only in careful penmanship and the strategic omission of certain truths. "Mr. Thorne, I presume," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular ice that well-bred contempt produces. "Yes, ma'am. You didn't mention in your correspondence that you were a giant." The word hung in the cold air between them. Not tall, not imposing, giant, as if he were something from a fairy tale, something that ate villages and terrorized children. Around them, other passengers had slowed their departures, sensing drama the way carrion birds sense death. "I'm 6'7", ma'am. I mentioned my height in my third letter. I thought—" 6'7". She repeated it like an accusation. "I assumed you were exaggerating in that masculine way men do. I didn't think you meant it literally. My late husband was 5'9", a respectable height, a normal height." Her driver, a thin man with sympathetic eyes, had already loaded Caleb's trunk onto her carriage. Now he stood uncertainly, one hand on the leather, waiting for direction that everyone on the platform knew was coming. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Margaret continued, straightening her spine as if preparing for a speech she'd rehearsed. "I'm looking for a husband, Mr. Thorne, not a spectacle. Willow Bend is a small town. We have standards, proportions to maintain. I cannot be seen with someone so conspicuous." She'd nodded to her driver then, a sharp little jerk of her head that contained multitudes of dismissal. The man had given Caleb an apologetic shrug and climbed onto the seat. As the carriage pulled away, someone in the small crowd that had gathered laughed, a bright, ugly sound that others quickly joined. "Poor bastard," a man in a cattleman's coat said, not quietly enough. "Came all this way to be measured and found too tall. That's a new one." "Margaret Whitmore's particular about things," his companion replied. "Remember when she sent back those curtains from Denver because they were the wrong shade of cream? As if cream has shades." More laughter. Caleb stood in the center of it, his bag in one hand, his dignity somewhere back down the tracks. The station master, an older gentleman with wire-rimmed spectacles, approached with the weathered kindness of someone who'd seen too much human foolishness to be shocked by any of it. "You got anywhere to go, son?" Caleb shook his head. "Just here. Just her." The station master studied him with the measuring look of a carpenter, checking if a board will fit. "You're a big one, all right. But I've seen bigger problems than height. Come on, let's get you out of this cold before you freeze into an ice sculpture for the town square." The station master's office was cramped, made more so by Caleb's presence. He had to duck through the doorway, angle his shoulders to fit through the frame. It was a dance he'd been doing since he was 14 and shot up past 6 feet like a bean plant in rich soil. The office smelled of coal smoke and old paper, and a potbelly stove in the corner threw grudging heat into the room. "Name's Ernest Hadley," the station master said, gesturing to a chair that Caleb eyed doubtfully. "Sit if you can manage it. That chair's seen worse than you." Caleb sat carefully, his knees nearly reaching his chest. Ernest poured coffee from a dented pot into 2 tin cups and passed one across the desk. "So, Ernest said, settling into his own chair with a sigh. Mail order arrangement gone wrong. It happens more than folks admit. Though usually it's the man who does the rejecting. Woman shows up older than she claimed, or heavier, or with children she forgot to mention. Vanity knows no gender. I told her my height, Caleb said quietly. Third letter. I stand 6'7" in my stockings. That's exactly what I wrote, clear as day. People read when they want to read, Ernest said. Hear what they want to hear. Margaret Whitmore probably saw those words and thought, oh, he's having a laugh, exaggerating like men do. She's a difficult woman at the best of times. Her late husband, God rest him, once told me she could find fault with a sunrise if she set her mind to it. Why would she advertise for a husband if she's so particular? Because she's lonelier than she is proud most days. But today, pride won. Ernest sipped his coffee, made a face, sipped again. Look, I'll be straight with you. Willow Bend isn't a large town. We've got a hotel, but the beds there won't fit you properly. Mrs. Chen, who runs it, is a good woman, but she's practical. She'll tell you the same thing I'm about to. You're in a tough spot. I noticed, Caleb said dryly. But, Ernest raised a finger. We've also got a church, and the church has a pastor, and the pastor has more Christian charity than sense sometimes. Name's Reverend Thomas Whitaker. Good man, kind man. Lost his wife 2 years back and throws himself into helping others like it'll fill the hole she left. If anyone in this town will help you find your feet, it'll be him. I don't need charity, Caleb said, the words coming out harder than he meant them to. I can work. I'm a blacksmith by trade. A good one. I can pay my way. Didn't say you couldn't. Ernest's eyes were kind above the rim of his cup. But right now you need a place to sleep tonight that doesn't involve freezing to death in a snowbank. We can worry about your pride tomorrow. Deal? Caleb looked into his coffee, seeing his reflection distorted on its surface. A giant, a spectacle. Too much. He'd been hearing variations of those words his whole life, but somehow, standing on that platform with Margaret Whitmore's rejection still ringing in his ears, they'd hit different, deeper. Deal, he said. Ernest smiled. Good man. Finish your coffee and I'll walk you to the church. It's not far, and the snow's letting up some. They stepped back out into the cold, into a town that was still laughing at him in doorways and behind frosted windows. Willow Bend revealed itself in pieces as they walked. A main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store with its windows full of goods, a saloon called the Silver Bell that was already doing evening business despite the early hour, a schoolhouse at the far end where children's voices rose in some recitation. It was a town like a dozen others Caleb had passed through, except this one was supposed to be different. This one was supposed to be his. He'd imagined walking these streets with Margaret on his arm, imagined neighbors nodding hello, imagined building something permanent after years of drifting from forge to forge, town to town, never quite fitting anywhere he landed. Don't let today poison the whole well, Ernest said, as if reading his thoughts. Towns are made of people, and people come in all kinds. Some, like Margaret, are small on the inside no matter how they puff themselves up. Others surprise you. The church was a white-painted building with a modest steeple, its bells silent in the snowy air. The door opened before they reached it, and a man in his 40s with graying hair and a warm smile stepped out. Ernest, he said, I heard we had some excitement at the station, and this must be Mr. Thorne. News travels, Ernest said, always does. Reverend Whitaker extended his hand to Caleb. Thomas Whitaker, welcome to Willow Bend, though I suspect the welcome you've received so far hasn't been what you hoped. His handshake was firm, his eyes direct. Caleb found himself liking the man immediately, which made him suspicious. In his experience, people who were nice to him usually wanted something. I appreciate your seeing me, Reverend, Caleb said carefully. Mr. Hadley said you might know of somewhere I could stay. I might at that. Come in, both of you. We'll talk properly inside where it's warm. The church's interior was simple but well kept. Rows of wooden pews led to a plain altar, and afternoon light filtered through windows that someone had recently cleaned. Caleb noted the details because details mattered. They told you whether a place was loved or merely maintained. This place was loved. The church has a back room. Reverend Whitaker said, leading them past the altar to a door at the rear. We use it for storage mostly, and as a place for me to work on sermons when I need quiet. But it has a cot, a stove, and privacy. The cot won't fit you properly, I'm afraid, but you're welcome to it until you find something better. He opened the door to reveal a space that was part office, part storage room. Books lined shelves on one wall, boxes of donated clothing occupied another, and in the corner sat a narrow cot that Caleb knew immediately would leave his feet dangling off the end. It's more than I have now, Caleb said. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You'll be earning your keep. The Reverend's smile was sly. I've been needing help with repairs around the church for months. The stove in the main hall smokes, the bell rope is fraying, and I suspect the roof will need patching before winter's done. If you're handy with tools, I am, Caleb said. Then we'll call it an even trade, room for labor. Reverend Whitaker paused. I should tell you, though, that Sunday services here are well attended. People will see you. Talk will happen. Willow Bend isn't cruel, generally speaking, but it's not always kind either. You'll need thick skin. I've got that, Caleb said. What he didn't say was that thickness was something you developed after years of being stared at, laughed at, treated as an oddity rather than a man. He'd built his skin thick as armor, and it still hurt sometimes. Ernest took his leave with a handshake and a promise to check in. Reverend Whitaker helped Caleb settle his few belongings into the back room, then left him alone with instructions to join him for dinner at the parsonage at 6. Alone in the quiet, Caleb sat on the too small cot and let himself feel the full weight of the day. He'd traveled 1,000 miles on hope and the promise of belonging. He'd arrived to rejection and laughter, and now he was sleeping in a church storage room in a town that saw him as a spectacle. He pulled out Margaret's letters from his bag, 6 of them, each folded carefully, each read and reread until the creases threatened to tear. Her handwriting was elegant, her words carefully chosen. She'd written about the town, about her late husband's business, about wanting a partner to help her manage it. She'd written about loneliness, about the hardness of facing each day alone. Not once had she mentioned that she was 5'4" and couldn't abide a man who made her feel smaller. Caleb held the letters over the stove in the corner, watched them catch and curl and burn. The lavender scent they'd carried disappeared into smoke. When they were ashes, he lay back on the cot, his feet hanging over the end as predicted, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in Willow Bend, Margaret Whitmore was probably congratulating herself on dodging a bullet. Somewhere in Willow Bend, people were still laughing about the giant who came to town and got sent away. But Caleb Thorne had learned a long time ago that sometimes the worst thing that could happen was exactly what needed to happen. Doors closed so that windows could open. Rejections cleared the path for something better. He didn't believe it yet, lying in that storage room with his pride still raw and bleeding. But he'd learned to act as if he believed it, which was sometimes the same thing. The days that followed established a pattern. Caleb woke with the dawn, ate a simple breakfast in his room, and set to work on the church repairs. The stove required parts he had to forge himself, which meant finding the town's existing blacksmith, a man named Hugh Morrison who ran a small operation behind the livery stable. Hugh was 60 if he was a day, with hands gnarled by arthritis and a perpetual squint from years of forge work. He looked Caleb up and down when he appeared in the doorway, measuring him the way smiths measure metal. Heard about you, Hugh said. The giant what got rejected? Word travels, Caleb replied evenly. In a town this size, word damn near sprints. Hugh gestured to the forge. Ernest Hadley says you're a smith. That true, or is it like the tall tales men tell to sound more interesting? It's true. Prove it. Hugh's challenge wasn't mean-spirited, Caleb realized, just practical. Talk was cheap. Skill was currency. He shrugged out of his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and studied the forge. It was well-maintained but old, the kind of setup that required you to know its quirks and rhythms. What do you need? Caleb asked. Andirons for the hotel. Mrs. Chen's been after me for weeks, but my hands don't work like they used to. Hugh flexed his fingers, and even from across the forge, Caleb could see the pain in the movement. You make me a decent set. I'll know you're what you claim. Caleb worked through the morning, falling into the familiar rhythm of heat and hammer. The metal sang under his hands, bending and shaping according to his will. He crafted the andirons with simple elegance, functional but with a subtle scrollwork that elevated them from merely useful to beautiful. When he finished, Hugh examined them with the critical eye of a master craftsman. He turned them over, tested their weight, ran his thumb along the scrollwork. Finally, he grunted, a sound that might have been approval. "You'll do," Hugh said. "You need forge work done for the church. You come use mine. No charge, if you'll help me with orders when these damn hands give out on me." "Deal?" "Deal," Caleb said. It was his first real foothold in Willow Bend, and it mattered more than Hugh probably knew. Sunday came with clear skies and bitter cold. Reverend Whitaker had warned him that services were well attended, but Caleb hadn't quite grasped what that meant until he emerged from the back room to find the church filling with people. They stared. Of course they stared. He was used to staring. What he wasn't used to was the particular quality of this staring, part curiosity, part judgment, part that strange mix of fear and fascination that tall people sometimes inspired in those of average height. He took a seat in the back pew, folding himself as small as possible, which wasn't very small at all. Families filled the rows ahead of him. Children craned their necks to look, earning sharp whispers from their parents. Margaret Whitmore sat in the third row, her back ramrod straight, refusing to turn around though Caleb could feel the awareness radiating from her. Reverend Whitaker's sermon was about mercy and second chances, which Caleb suspected wasn't coincidental. The Reverend had a gift for speaking truth without making it feel like accusation, for challenging his congregation while still making them feel seen and loved. "We live in a world that measures," Reverend Whitaker said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet church. "Measures height and weight, measures worth and value, measures who fits and who doesn't. But the God I know doesn't work with measuring sticks. The God I know looks at hearts, not proportions." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Caleb kept his eyes on the altar, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. After the service, most people filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact, but a few lingered, and Caleb found himself the subject of cautious curiosity. "You're the blacksmith helping Hugh Morrison?" an older woman asked. She wore a respectable black dress and had kind eyes. "I'm Martha Boone. My husband runs the general store." "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. "Hugh says you're skilled. We could use skilled craftsmen in this town." She paused. "Don't let the gossips get to you. They'll find someone else to talk about soon enough. They always do." It was a small kindness, but Caleb tucked it away carefully. Small kindnesses were what kept you going sometimes. He was heading back to his room when he noticed a woman still sitting in one of the middle pews. She was alone, her head bowed, and something about her stillness caught his attention. She wasn't praying exactly. Her posture was too tense for that. She was thinking. Or maybe hiding. Caleb started to move past, not wanting to intrude, but she looked up as if sensing his presence. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. She was perhaps in her early 30s, with dark hair pinned simply and a face that had seen trouble but hadn't broken under it. What struck him most, though, were her hands. She held them folded in her lap, but he could see the scarring on the left one, old burn marks that had healed badly, leaving the skin twisted and discolored. "You're Mr. Thorne," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am. I'm Ruth Callahan." She stood, smoothing her skirt with her scarred hand unselfconsciously. "I wanted to apologize for the town's behavior. What Margaret did wasn't right." "You don't need to apologize for other people's choices," Caleb said carefully. "Maybe not, but someone should acknowledge it was wrong." She studied him with clear gray eyes. "You look like someone who listens more than he speaks." It was such an odd thing to say, such a specific observation, that Caleb found himself genuinely curious about her. "Is that a compliment?" "In my experience, yes." A small smile touched her lips. "Talkers are common. Listeners are rare." She moved past him then, heading for the door, and Caleb watched her go. There was something about the way she carried herself, straight-backed despite whatever tragedy had marked her hand, present despite the town's obvious tendency to judge and exclude. "That's Ruth Callahan," Reverend Whitaker said, appearing beside him. "Widow. Lost her husband 4 years back to influenza. Got that scar saving a child from a burning building. Thomas Chen, Mrs. Chen's youngest boy. Ran in when everyone else was running out. Brave, Caleb said. Brave and foolish are often the same thing, depending on who's telling the story. The Reverend clasped his hands behind his back. She's had her share of talk, too. Some folks said she was showing off, running into that fire. Said a proper woman would have waited for the men. Others said the scar made her unmarriageable, like beauty is the only thing that gives a woman value. She's handled it with more grace than I would have. Seems like this town has a lot of opinions about who people should be. Most towns do. The question is whether you let those opinions define you or whether you define yourself. Reverend Whitaker turned to face Caleb directly. You've been here almost a week now. How are you finding it? Honestly, I'm not sure yet. Caleb considered his words carefully. Part of me wants to leave. Go somewhere I'm not the giant who got rejected. Start fresh where nobody knows that story. You could do that, the Reverend agreed. Run every time things get hard, but you'll find that you take yourself with you wherever you go. The next town will have its own Margaret Whitmore, its own gossips and measurers. The question isn't whether you'll face rejection, it's whether you'll let rejection be the last word on who you are. It was the kind of wisdom that was obvious once spoken, but easy to forget in the moment. Caleb nodded slowly. Besides, Reverend Whitaker added, a twinkle in his eye, you haven't finished fixing that stove yet, and I'm told Mrs. Chen is very impressed with those andirons you made. Word of your skill is spreading. Give it time. Let people see you for who you are, not just how tall you stand. Time. It seemed to be what everyone advised, as if time were some magical salve that healed all wounds and solved all problems. But Caleb had learned that time only worked if you filled it with purpose, with action, with the slow building of something worth staying for. So he stayed. He worked. He fixed the stove, which required 3 days of careful labor and 2 trips to Hugh's forge for parts. He patched the roof, discovering in the process that he wasn't afraid of heights, which made sense, given that he spent most of his life looking down at everyone else. He repaired the bell rope with new manila line, climbing up into the steeple where the rope attached. And while he was up there, he took a moment to look out over Willow Bend. From that height, the town looked almost peaceful. Smoke curled from chimneys. People moved along the main street like pieces on a game board. The mountains ringed everything, keeping the world at bay. It was easy to see why people chose to settle here, despite the harsh winters and the isolation. It was also easy to see how small-minded people could grow in a place like this, where the same faces appeared day after day, where novelty was suspect and difference was threat. But there were good people here too. Martha Boone, who'd spoken a kind word. Hugh Morrison, who'd given him work. Reverend Whitaker, who'd given him shelter. And Ruth Callahan, who'd apologized for someone else's cruelty, as if kindness were a responsibility we all shared. He climbed down from the steeple and went back to work. It was Tuesday afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after his arrival, when Caleb encountered Ruth Callahan again. He was in the churchyard, splitting firewood for the parsonage, when she appeared at the gate. She carried a covered basket and wore a coat that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Just giving this wood what it deserves," Caleb said, setting down his axe. He was sweating despite the cold, and he knew he probably looked rough, shirt sleeves rolled up, hair disheveled. "Can I help you with something, Mrs. Callahan?" "Ruth," she corrected. "Mrs. Callahan was my mother-in-law, and she was a terror. I'm just Ruth." "Then I'm just Caleb." She smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Fair enough. I brought something for you. Don't get excited, it's not much. Just some bread and preserves. I heard you've been eating out of tin cans, and I figured you could use something that didn't come from the general store." She held out the basket, and Caleb took it carefully. It was heavier than he expected, packed with not just bread but cheese, dried apples, and a jar of what looked like strawberry preserves. "This is too much," he said. "It's exactly enough," Ruth replied firmly. "You're working hard, and hard work requires good food. Besides, I make too much bread for just me. It'll go stale if someone doesn't eat it." It was a lie, Caleb suspected. A kind lie, designed to let him accept her generosity without feeling like charity. But he accepted it anyway because refusing would have been its own kind of rudeness. Thank you, he said. This is kind. More than kind. You're welcome. She didn't leave immediately, instead looking around the churchyard with assessing eyes. The Reverend's been after me to help with the garden come spring. Says it's gotten away from him since his wife passed. Do you garden? Never had one long enough to tend, Caleb admitted. I've moved around a lot, but I'm willing to learn. It's peaceful work, Ruth said. There's something satisfying about putting seeds in the ground and watching them grow. It's one of the few things in life that actually makes sense. You put in the effort, you get the reward. Unlike people, Caleb said. Unlike people, she agreed. People are complicated. Plants are straightforward. I like straightforward. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and Caleb found himself studying her properly for the first time. She wasn't beautiful in the way Margaret Whitmore was beautiful. There was nothing arranged or calculated about her appearance, but there was something solid about her, something real. She looked like a woman who'd survived things and learned from them, who'd been tested and hadn't broken. I should let you get back to your wood, Ruth said finally. But I hope the food helps, and if you need anything else, I'll let you know, Caleb promised, though he wasn't sure he would. Asking for help had never come easy to him. Ruth nodded and turned to go, then paused at the gate. Caleb, don't let this town make you small. I know it tries, but don't let it. She was gone before he could respond, leaving him standing in the churchyard with a basket of food and the distinct feeling that something important had just happened, though he couldn't quite name what. That night, he ate Ruth's bread with her preserves and thought about her scarred hand, about the way she'd spoken of saving a child from fire as if it were nothing remarkable, about the way she'd looked at him, not up at him, not measuring him against some standard he'd never meet, but simply at him, seeing him. It had been a long time since anyone had seen him. The weeks crept toward March, and with them came a subtle shift in how Willow Bend treated Caleb. He wasn't accepted exactly, but he was becoming familiar. The strangeness was wearing off. People nodded hello on the street. Martha Boone invited him to dinner at her home, where he met her husband Samuel, a practical man who talked about the hardware business and asked intelligent questions about smithing. Mrs. Chen commissioned a set of decorative hinges for the hotel, paying him fairly and recommending him to others. He fell into a routine, mornings at Hughes Forge, working on commissions and repairs, afternoons at the church, finishing the repairs and starting on new projects the Reverend dreamed up, evenings in his small room, reading by lamplight or staring at the ceiling and wondering what he was building toward. Ruth appeared regularly, always with some excuse, bringing food, consulting about the garden plans, borrowing a tool that Caleb suspected she didn't actually need. They developed an easy friendship, the kind built on comfortable silences and occasional honest conversation. She never asked about Margaret Whitmore, never referenced his arrival or the rejection that had brought him to Willow Bend. She simply treated him like a person, which was more valuable than she probably knew. "You're good with your hands," she observed one afternoon, watching him repair a section of the churchyard fence. "Did you always want to be a blacksmith?" "No," Caleb admitted. "When I was young, I wanted to be normal-sized. When that didn't work out, I figured I might as well be useful." Ruth laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. Practical. Necessary. He drove another nail home, testing the board's stability. People don't know what to do with someone my size. They either want to make a spectacle of you or pretend you don't exist. Being skilled at something useful gives them a reason to tolerate you. "That's a sad way to view yourself," Ruth said quietly. "It's an honest way." Honest and sad aren't mutually exclusive. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I used to think the same thing about my hand. Thought that if I could just be useful enough, good enough, people would overlook the scars. But that's not how it works. You can't earn your way out of other people's judgments." Caleb looked at her properly then. "So what changed?" "I stopped trying," Ruth said simply. "I stopped contorting myself to fit into other people's ideas of acceptable. I decided that anyone who couldn't see past my scars wasn't worth knowing anyway. It's lonely sometimes, but it's better than the alternative." Her words settled over him like snow, quiet, persistent, gradually changing the landscape. He'd spent years trying to minimize himself, to take up less space, to be acceptable despite his height. And it had never worked. People either saw him as too much or not enough, never just right. Maybe Ruth was onto something. Maybe the answer wasn't to keep trying to fit. Maybe the answer was to stop apologizing for taking up space. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For being honest. For being, He struggled to find the right word. "Real." Ruth smiled, that small, genuine smile he was coming to recognize. "You make it easy, Caleb Thorne. You're real too, whether you believe it or not." She left him to his fence work, but her words stayed with him through the rest of the afternoon, through dinner, through the evening. They stayed with him as he lay in his too small bed, staring at the ceiling, considering what it might mean to stop apologizing for existing. It was a radical thought, a dangerous thought, but also maybe a necessary one. March brought the first hints of spring, warmer afternoons, patches of bare ground appearing through the snow, birds returning from wherever birds went in winter. And with spring came the town's annual meeting to discuss community projects and needs. Reverend Whitaker had encouraged Caleb to attend, suggesting that visibility would help him integrate into town life. Caleb was skeptical. Visibility had rarely worked in his favor, but he went anyway, curious to see how a town like Willow Bend made decisions. The meeting was held in the church, which meant Caleb had the surreal experience of attending an event in his own bedroom, essentially. People filled the pews, familiar faces mixed with a few he hadn't met yet. Margaret Whitmore sat near the front, still avoiding looking anywhere near him. Ruth sat in the middle, saving him a seat with a small gesture that felt significant. The meeting covered the usual small-town business, roads that needed work, a new school teacher to be hired, debates over property boundaries and water rights. Caleb listened, learning the town's rhythms and dynamics, who held power and who merely held opinions. Then Samuel Boone stood, his normally cheerful face serious. "We need to talk about the orphanage bell tower." A ripple of concern moved through the crowd. The orphanage, Caleb learned through the subsequent discussion, was a small building at the edge of town that housed 6 children whose parents had died or abandoned them. The bell tower, which served to call the children for meals and alert the town in emergencies, was structurally unsound. It needed to be rebuilt before it collapsed and killed someone. "The problem," Samuel explained, "is cost. We've had 3 contractors give estimates, and even the cheapest one is more than we can afford. The church fund can contribute some, but not enough." "What about volunteer labor?" someone suggested. "Surely we can find men willing to work." "It's not just labor," Hugh Morrison said, standing with difficulty from his pew. "It's specialized work. The tower needs to be tall enough to be useful, stable enough to be safe. That requires someone who knows what they're doing." "And lumber," someone else added. "We'd still need to buy materials." The discussion went in circles for a while, everyone agreeing something needed to be done, but no one sure how to do it. Caleb listened, his mind already working through the problem. He'd built structures before, including a grain elevator in Kansas that still stood. Height didn't intimidate him. And if the issue was cost, he stood, and the room fell silent. Every eye turned to him, and he felt the familiar weight of being too visible, too much. But Ruth's words echoed in his mind. "Don't let this town make you small." "I could do it," Caleb said. "Build the tower, I mean. If Hugh can spare the time to help with measurements, and if the church will provide materials at cost, I'll donate the labor." The silence stretched. People exchanged glances. Someone in the back whispered something that made their neighbor laugh quietly. Then Reverend Whitaker stood. "That's an extraordinarily generous offer, Caleb. Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Caleb looked around the room, meeting eyes that had been avoiding him for weeks. "I'm good at building things that need to stand tall, and those kids need a safe tower. Seems like a good match." Martha Boone started clapping, and slowly others joined in. It wasn't universal. Margaret Whitmore kept her hands firmly in her lap, and several others looked skeptical, but it was enough. It was a beginning. After the meeting, Ruth found him outside where he'd escaped the crowd to breathe cold air and collect his thoughts. "That was brave," she said. "That was stupid," Caleb countered. "I have no idea if they'll even let me do it. And if they do, I just volunteered for months of work." "Brave and stupid are often the same thing," Ruth said, echoing something Reverend Whitaker had once told him. "But you did it anyway. That matters." "Does it?" Caleb looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. I'm trying, Ruth. I'm trying to be part of this place, but I'm not sure it wants me. Some of it doesn't, Ruth agreed. Some of it never will. Margaret Whitmore will probably go to her grave thinking she made the right choice rejecting you, but some of us— She paused, choosing her words carefully. Some of us are glad you stayed. Glad you're here. The words hung between them, meaning more than their surface suggested. Caleb looked at her, at this woman with her scarred hand and her honest eyes, and felt something shift inside him. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The recognition that she saw him not as a giant or a spectacle or a mistake, but as a man, just a man, flawed and uncertain and trying his best. I'm glad I stayed too, he said quietly. Even when it's hard, I'm glad. Ruth smiled, and in that moment, standing in the churchyard under emerging stars, Caleb Thorne felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like he might belong. The work on the orphanage bell tower began on a Monday morning when the ground had finally thawed enough to dig proper foundations. Caleb arrived at dawn to find he wasn't alone. Hugh Morrison was already there, laying out tools with his gnarled hands, and beside him stood 3 other men from town. One was Samuel Boone, another was a farmer named Jack Peterson, and the third was a young carpenter's apprentice named Daniel, who couldn't have been more than 17. Heard you could use some help, Samuel said, extending his hand. Volunteering labor is contagious, apparently. Caleb shook his hand, then the others, feeling something warm and unfamiliar expanding in his chest. He'd expected to do this alone, had prepared himself for the isolation of solo work. The presence of help, freely given, was unexpected enough to momentarily rob him of words. Much appreciated, he managed finally. Let's build something that'll outlast all of us. The work was hard and honest. They dug the foundation posts deep, sinking them into holes that Caleb measured 3 times, because precision mattered when you were building something meant to stand for generations. Hugh supervised with the eye of experience, calling out adjustments and occasionally taking over when the work required a steady hand that arthritis made difficult but not impossible. By mid-morning, Ruth appeared with a basket of food and a large jug of water. She'd brought enough for everyone, as if she'd known somehow that Caleb wouldn't be working alone. You're a mind reader, Samuel said gratefully, accepting a sandwich. I'm a practical woman, Ruth corrected. Men working hard need feeding, and I had bread to spare. She stayed while they ate, sitting on a stack of lumber and listening to the men discuss the tower's design. Caleb had sketched plans the night before, working by lamplight to create something that would be both functional and beautiful. The tower would be 20 feet tall, built from sturdy pine with a copper-topped roof that would weather to green over time. The bell, donated by a church in Denver that had upgraded to a larger one, would hang in an open belfry where its sound could carry across the whole town. You've thought this through, Hugh observed, studying the sketches. That's good. Too many people build first and think later, then wonder why things fall down. My father was a shipwright, Caleb said. It was the first time he'd mentioned his family to anyone in Willow Bend. He taught me that the planning matters as much as the building, maybe more. Was? Ruth asked gently. He died when I was 16. Storm took his ship off the Carolina coast. Caleb folded the sketches carefully. He was a good man. Didn't care that I grew taller than him before I could shave. Just cared that I learned the work. The men were quiet for a moment, the kind of respectful silence that followed mentions of the dead. Then Daniel, the young apprentice, spoke up with the guileless curiosity of youth. Is it hard? Being so tall, I mean. Daniel, Samuel said sharply. That's rude. No, it's honest, Caleb said. He looked at the boy, seeing genuine interest rather than mockery. Yes, it's hard sometimes. Doorways are too short. Beds don't fit. People stare. But it's also just how I am, same as you're left-handed, or Hugh's got blue eyes. You learn to work with what you're given. I think it's interesting, Daniel said. My uncle was tall too. Not as tall as you, but tall enough that he played it up. Wore a big hat, stood up straight, made himself memorable. He said if people were going to stare anyway, might as well give them something worth looking at. Your uncle sounds like a showman, Hugh said. He was a salesman, Daniel replied with a grin. So, yes. They returned to work, the conversation flowing easily now. Caleb found himself relaxing into the rhythm of it. The physical labor, the casual talk, the sense of working toward something larger than himself. This was what he'd imagined when he'd answered Margaret's letters, belonging to a community, contributing something meaningful, being part of the daily fabric of a town's life. By evening, the foundation posts were set and the first frame timbers were cut and ready. The men departed with promises to return tomorrow, and Caleb stayed behind to clean up the worksite. He was stacking lumber when he heard footsteps and turned to find Ruth approaching. "You should have gone home hours ago," he said. "So should you." She surveyed the worksite with satisfaction. "It's coming together nicely. You're good at this." "I'm good at building things that don't talk back," Caleb said. "It's people I'm not so sure about." "People are just buildings that move," Ruth said. "Same principles apply. You need a strong foundation, careful planning, and patience when things don't fit together right away." Caleb laughed, a genuine sound that surprised him. "That's either very wise or complete nonsense. I'm not sure which." "Can it be both?" Ruth smiled. "Walk me home? It's getting dark and the road's still muddy." They walked through the twilight, their breath misting in the cooling air. Ruth's home, Caleb learned, was a small cottage on the eastern edge of town with a garden plot that was just beginning to show the first green shoots of spring. "I planted early peas 3 weeks ago," Ruth said, gesturing to the garden. "They're stubborn things. Come up even when the ground's half frozen. I admire that." "Plants that don't give up easy," Caleb observed. "Exactly." She paused at her gate, her hand resting on the weathered wood. "Thank you for walking me home, and thank you for what you're doing for those children. The orphanage is important to me. I almost ended up there myself after my parents died. Would have, if my aunt hadn't taken me in." "I didn't know," Caleb said. "Not many people do. I don't advertise it." Ruth looked toward her cottage, where lamplight glowed in a window. "But it makes me protective of those kids. They didn't choose their circumstances. They're just trying to survive in a world that hasn't been particularly kind to them." "I understand that," Caleb said quietly. "More than you might think." Ruth met his eyes in the fading light. "I know you do. That's why you're building the tower, isn't it? Not for recognition or gratitude, but because you know what it's like to need something solid to hold on to." She'd seen through him so clearly that Caleb felt exposed, but not uncomfortably so. It was the difference between being examined and being understood. "Get some rest," Ruth said gently. "Tomorrow's another long day." She disappeared inside, and Caleb walked back through the darkening streets of Willow Bend, thinking about early peas and stubborn growth and the way some people could see straight through your walls without making you want to build them higher. The tower rose slowly over the following weeks, timber by timber, nail by nail. The work attracted attention, both good and bad. Children from the orphanage came to watch, their faces pressed against the fence, asking endless questions that Caleb answered patiently. Their caretaker, Miss Sarah Brennan, brought lemonade and gratitude, her eyes suspiciously bright when she thanked him. "Those children have had so little good fortune," she said. "Seeing someone build something just for them, with no expectation of return? It matters, Mr. Thorne. It matters more than you know." But not everyone was pleased. Caleb overheard conversations in town, whispers that followed him through the general store and the post office. Some people questioned his motives, others suggested the tower was unnecessary, a waste of resources. Margaret Whitmore, he learned through the reliable gossip network that was Willow Bend, had expressed concern that having such a tall structure built by such a tall man was asking for disaster. "Let them talk," Hugh said one afternoon, handing Caleb a level. Margaret Whitmore would find fault with Jesus Christ himself if he came down and fixed her front steps. Some people are only happy when they're unhappy about something. "It bothers me less than it did," Caleb admitted. "A month ago, I would have taken it personal. Now I just think they're wasting their energy on opinions nobody asked for." "That's growth," Hugh said approvingly. "That's you learning that other people's small minds don't have to make you smaller." The tower reached 10 feet, then 15, then 18. Caleb worked at the top, comfortable with heights that made other men nervous. From up there, he could see across most of Willow Bend, the residential streets spreading out like spokes, the commercial district clustered around Main Street, the mountains rising beyond like patient sentinels. He could also see Ruth's cottage, and more than once he spotted her working in her garden, her scarred hand moving confidently through the soil. Sometimes she'd look up and wave, as if she knew he was watching. Sometimes he'd wave back, wondering when exactly she'd become the person he looked for in crowds, the voice he listened for in conversations. One evening, after the other workers had gone home, Ruth climbed the ladder to where Caleb was fitting the final beam into place. She emerged onto the platform with determination, though her hands gripped the ladder tightly. "You're not fond of heights," Caleb observed, steadying her as she stepped onto the platform. "No, I'm terrified of them," Ruth said, "but I wanted to see what you see from up here." They stood together on the narrow platform, the town spread out beneath them in the golden light of approaching sunset. The wind moved through Ruth's hair, pulling strands loose from their pins. She gripped the railing with both hands, the scarred one and the whole one, holding on like she was holding on to the world itself. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Frightening, but beautiful." "That describes most worthwhile things," Caleb said. Ruth looked at him then, really looked at him, and Caleb felt the air between them change into something charged with possibility. He'd felt this before with other women, but it had always been tangled up with their discomfort at his height, their need to either diminish him or make him into something exotic. With Ruth, it was different. With Ruth, it was clean and clear, uncomplicated by anything except the simple fact of two people recognizing something in each other. "Caleb," she began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider her words. "Thank you for being patient with this town, for being patient with me." "You don't need my patience," Caleb said. "You've been nothing but kind since the day we met." "I've been cautious," Ruth corrected. "I've been careful. I liked you immediately, which made me nervous. I've been hurt before, and I promised myself I'd be smarter about guarding my heart." She laughed, a small, self-deprecating sound. "But you make it hard to be smart about that." "Ruth, let me finish," she said, her grip tightening on the railing. "I know what people say about me, about my hand, about being unmarriageable, about being damaged goods. I've heard it all. And I told myself I didn't care, that I was fine alone. But then you came to town, and you were so obviously good despite everyone treating you like you weren't, and I thought maybe loneliness isn't something we have to just accept." The sun was setting properly now, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Below them, lamps were being lit in windows, creating constellations of domestic light. Caleb turned to face Ruth fully, this woman who'd climbed a ladder despite her fear just to stand beside him. "I came to Willow Bend looking for someone who'd accept me despite my height," Caleb said carefully. "Someone who'd overlook it, or at least tolerate it. But you've never made me feel like my height was something that needed overlooking. You just see me, all of me. And that's worth more than I know how to say." "So say it badly," Ruth suggested, and there was light in her eyes now, something that looked like hope. "I care about you," Caleb said. "I think about you when I'm working. I look for you in church. I save interesting thoughts to tell you later. He struggled to find the right words. "I'm happier here than I've been anywhere, and that's mostly because of you." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, and Caleb felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Then she smiled, that small, genuine smile that meant more to him than all of Margaret Whitmore's careful beauty ever had. "I care about you too," she said. "Quite a lot, actually. Enough that it scares me." "We could be scared together," Caleb offered. Ruth laughed, the sound carrying across the evening air. "That's the worst romantic proposal I've ever heard." "I'm out of practice," Caleb admitted, "but I'm sincere." "I know you are. That's what makes it work." Ruth released the railing with one hand and reached for his, lacing her scarred fingers through his calloused ones. "Help me down this ladder before I lose my nerve entirely, and then walk me home. We can figure out the rest as we go." They climbed down together, Caleb going first so he could steady the ladder, Ruth following with the concentration of someone conquering a genuine fear. On solid ground, she let out a breath of relief. "I can't believe I climbed that," she said. "I can," Caleb replied. "You ran into a burning building. A ladder's nothing." "The building was different. I didn't have time to think about being afraid." Ruth started walking, and Caleb fell into step beside her. But with the latter, I had all the time in the world to imagine falling. Fear works different when you have time to think about it. Is that why you were cautious with me? Time to think? Partly. Ruth was quiet for a moment, then continued. After my husband died, people were kind at first, but kindness has a shelf life in a small town. After a while, they started suggesting I needed to move on, find another husband, stop dwelling, and then I got this. She raised her scarred hand, saving Thomas Chen, and suddenly I went from widow to damaged widow. The suggestions stopped. The pity increased. I became someone to feel sorry for rather than someone who might have her own desires and plans. That must have been awful, Caleb said. It was freeing, in a strange way, Ruth said. Once people decided I was unmarriageable, they stopped having expectations. I could just be myself. But it was also lonely. And then you arrived, rejected and humiliated, and I saw someone else who'd been measured and found wanting by people who shouldn't get to measure anyone. She glanced up at him. I suppose I recognized a kindred spirit. They'd reached her cottage. The garden was fully dark now, but the smell of growing things hung in the air, earth and green shoots and possibility. Ruth didn't immediately go inside, instead standing at her gate the way she had that first night. Come to dinner tomorrow, she said. I'll make something that isn't bread and preserves. We can talk more, properly, without ladders or work crews or the whole town watching. I'd like that, Caleb said. Good. Ruth smiled, and there was something in her expression that made Caleb's breath catch, a openness, a willingness to see where this led despite the fear. 6 o'clock. Don't be late. Don't? Yes, ma'am. She laughed and disappeared inside, and Caleb walked back through Willow Bend feeling like the evening air was somehow lighter, like gravity had loosened its hold just enough to let him float. The next day crawled past with agonizing slowness. Every hour felt like 3, every task like it took twice as long as it should. Hugh noticed and made no effort to hide his amusement. You're distracted, he observed as Caleb measured the same board 3 times and got 3 different numbers. I'm focused, Caleb protested. You're thinking about Ruth Callahan, Hugh corrected, which is fine. She's a good woman, better than most. But maybe you could think about her after you finish this hinge instead of before. Otherwise you'll cut your damn finger off and she'll have to nurse you back to health, which seems like a poor foundation for courtship. We're not courting, Caleb said, then heard how ridiculous that sounded given that he was having dinner with her in a few hours. Sure you're not, Hugh said agreeably. And I'm not old and my hands don't hurt. We all tell ourselves stories, son. At 5:30, Caleb cleaned up and changed into his best shirt, which wasn't saying much given his limited wardrobe. He'd grown accustomed to clothes that were slightly too short in the sleeves, shirts that pulled tight across the shoulders. Finding things that fit had always been a challenge, and he'd learned to make do. Still, he did his best. He washed thoroughly, combed his hair, checked his reflection in the small mirror above his wash basin. The face that looked back at him was weathered and uncertain, but not unkind. It was the face of a man who'd been beaten down but hadn't stayed down, who'd learned that resilience was something you practiced rather than something you possessed. He hoped it was enough. Ruth's cottage glowed with welcoming light when he arrived at exactly 6 o'clock. She answered his knock immediately, as if she'd been waiting by the door, and ushered him inside with a smile that eased some of his nervousness. The interior was small but comfortable, furnished with pieces that had clearly been chosen for function rather than fashion. A worn sofa sat before a fireplace where a modest fire burned. Bookshelves lined one wall, packed with volumes that showed signs of repeated reading. The kitchen, visible through an open doorway, smelled of roasting chicken and herbs. It's not much, Ruth said, following his gaze, but it's mine, paid for free and clear. That matters to me. It's nice, Caleb said honestly. It feels lived in, loved. That's kind of you to say. Ruth gestured to the sofa. Sit, please. Dinner's almost ready, but we have time to talk first. Can I get you something to drink? I have coffee or water, or there's some cider if you prefer. Coffee would be good. She brought 2 cups from the kitchen and settled beside him on the sofa, tucking her legs under her in a gesture that was unconsciously intimate. This close, Caleb could see the silver threads beginning to appear in her dark hair, the fine lines around her eyes that suggested she smiled more than she frowned. Tell me something about yourself that I don't know, Ruth said. Something real. That's a dangerous request, Caleb said. What if I'm boring? You built a bell tower out of nothing but lumber and determination. You're not boring. Ruth sipped her coffee. Come on. Something true. Caleb thought about it, turning through memories like pages in a book. When I was young, maybe 8 or 9, I wanted to be invisible. I'd stand in front of mirrors and try to will myself smaller, like if I concentrated hard enough, I could just shrink down to normal. It never worked, obviously. But I spent months trying. Ruth's expression softened. That breaks my heart a little. Don't let it, Caleb said. I'm not that boy anymore. I've made peace with taking up space. Have you? Ruth asked gently. Or have you just gotten better at pretending you have? The question landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Caleb found himself unable to meet her eyes for a moment, studying his coffee instead. I'm working on it, he said finally. Some days are better than others. But being here, building the tower, talking with you, it helps. It makes me feel like maybe I don't have to apologize for existing. You never did, Ruth said firmly. Not to me, not to anyone. Existing isn't something you need permission for. They were quiet for a moment, sitting in the kind of comfortable silence that only happens between people who don't feel the need to fill every gap with words. The fire crackled. Outside, wind moved through the trees with a sound like distant conversation. Your turn, Caleb said. Tell me something true about Ruth Callahan. Ruth set down her coffee cup and held up her scarred hand, studying it in the firelight. When I pulled Thomas Chen from that fire, I knew I'd be burned. I could feel the heat through the wet blanket I'd wrapped around myself. But what I remember most isn't the pain, though God knows there was plenty of that. What I remember is thinking, this will matter. This will be something I did that actually mattered. She lowered her hand. My husband was a good man, but our marriage was comfortable, safe. We were fond of each other, but I'm not sure we were in love, not really. And when he died, I felt grief. But I also felt relief because I didn't have to pretend anymore. I could just be alone and figure out who I actually was rather than who I was supposed to be. She glanced at Caleb. Does that make me terrible? It makes you honest, Caleb said, and brave. Most people would rather pretend than face that kind of truth about themselves. Maybe, Ruth smiled slightly. But now I'm older and scarred and supposedly unmarriageable, and some days I wonder if I was too hasty embracing solitude. Because it turns out that being alone and being lonely are different things, and I'm lonelier than I like to admit. The vulnerability in her words called to something in Caleb, some matching loneliness he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing its weight. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her scarred hand in his. I understand, he said simply. Ruth's fingers curled around his, holding on like he was something solid in a shifting world. I know you do. That's why I invited you here. Dinner was simple but good. Roasted chicken with potatoes and carrots, bread that Ruth had baked that morning, the sharp tang of cider to wash it down. They talked easily, trading stories about their pasts, their families, the strange paths that had led them both to Willow Bend. Caleb learned that Ruth's aunt had been a teacher who'd instilled in her a love of reading and a distrust of people who valued appearance over substance. Ruth learned that Caleb's mother had died when he was young, leaving him to be raised by a father who'd loved him fiercely but hadn't known quite what to do with a son who grew too tall too fast. He tried, Caleb said, pushing carrots around his plate. He really did. But I could see it confused him, like he'd expected one thing and got another. He never said it, but I knew. Parents try to hide their disappointment, but children always know. Was he disappointed? Ruth asked. Or was he worried? There's a difference. Caleb considered that. Maybe worried. Maybe he saw how people treated me and knew life would be harder because of it. That's not the same as disappointment, I guess. No, Ruth agreed. It's love wearing anxiety's face. After dinner, they moved back to the sofa, sitting closer now than they had before. The fire had burned down to coals, throwing shifting shadows across the room. Outside, the night had settled in properly, wrapping the cottage in darkness that made the inside feel even more warm and safe. I should probably go, Caleb said, though he made no move to stand. Probably, Ruth agreed, also not moving. You don't have to yet." So he stayed. They talked about the tower, about the garden Ruth was planning, about books they'd read and places they'd been. It was the kind of conversation that meandered pleasantly, finding connection in unexpected places. And underneath it all ran the current of something deeper, something that neither of them was quite ready to name, but both of them felt. When Caleb finally left, well past 10 o'clock, Ruth walked him to the door and stood in the doorway while he descended the porch steps. The night air was cold after the warmth of her cottage, but Caleb barely noticed. "Thank you," he said, turning back to face her. "For dinner, for talking, for seeing you," Ruth supplied. "Yes, for that." "Thank you for being worth seeing," Ruth replied. "Come back soon, Caleb Thorne. My door's always open to you." Walking back through the dark streets of Willow Bend, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope that had brought him west on the promise of a mail-order marriage, but something quieter and more sustainable. The hope that came from genuine connection, from being known and accepted, from finding someone who made you want to be better without demanding that you be different. The tower was finished 3 weeks later on a bright April morning when the mountains still wore snow on their peaks, but the valley below had turned green. The whole town turned out for the dedication ceremony. Even Margaret Whitmore, though she stood at the back and left before the Reverend finished his blessing. The orphanage children were given the honor of ringing the bell first. Miss Brennan lifted young Thomas Chen, now fully recovered from whatever illness or injury had required his rescue years ago, and helped him grip the rope. The bell's voice rang out clear and strong, carrying across Willow Bend with a sound that spoke of safety and gathering, of community and care. Caleb stood beside Ruth, watching the children's faces light up with joy, and felt a satisfaction deeper than anything he'd experienced in his previous peripatetic life. This was what it meant to build something lasting. Not just the physical structure, though that mattered, but the connections forged in its creation. The friendships with Hugh and Samuel and Daniel. The respect of townspeople who'd watched him work without complaint through rain and wind. The trust of children who'd seen him as someone solid and reliable. And Ruth standing beside him with her hand in his, no longer hiding the scars or the feelings that went with them. "You did good," she said quietly, under the cover of the bells ringing and the children's cheers. "We did good," Caleb corrected. "Couldn't have finished without help." "That's growth too," Ruth observed. "Accepting help, being part of something bigger than yourself." Reverend Whitaker called for quiet and gave a short speech about community and sacrifice and the way that individuals could come together to create something meaningful. He thanked everyone who'd contributed, but when he thanked Caleb specifically, the applause was genuine and sustained. People Caleb barely knew came up afterward to shake his hand, to tell him the tower was beautiful, to ask if he might help with other projects around town. Even Hugh, not given to displays of emotion, clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You've earned your place here, son. Don't forget that." But the moment that mattered most came later, after the crowd had dispersed and the children had gone inside for their lessons. Caleb and Ruth stood alone in the orphanage yard, looking up at the tower that reached toward the blue spring sky. "I was wrong," Ruth said. "About what?" "That first day we really talked, I said you looked like someone who listens more than he speaks. But you're more than that." She turned to face him fully. "You're someone who builds what others only talk about. Someone who shows up when it's hard. Someone who stays." "I'm staying because of you," Caleb said honestly. "This town, this place, it would just be another stop if you weren't here." Ruth's eyes grew bright, though whether from tears or joy or both, Caleb couldn't tell. "Then I'm glad I climbed that ladder. Glad I let myself be scared and did it anyway." "Best decision you ever made," Caleb said. "Second best," Ruth corrected. "The best was deciding to talk to you in the first place, back in the church when you looked so lost and alone." "I was lost and alone." "Not anymore." Ruth stepped closer, closing the distance between them until Caleb could see the flecks of gold in her gray eyes, could smell the lavender soap she used. "You found something here, or maybe something found you." "Ruth," Caleb said, his voice rough with feeling, "I know we haven't known each other long. I know there's still talk in town, still people who think I'm too much of this or not enough of that. But I want you to know that whatever this is between us, I'm in it, completely. I'm not going anywhere." "Good," Ruth said simply. "Neither am I." She reached up, and she had to reach up, even standing close, and touched his face with her scarred hand. Caleb turned into the touch instinctively, pressing his cheek against her palm. It was the most natural thing in the world, as natural as breathing or the sun rising or early peas pushing through half-frozen ground. "Kiss me," Ruth whispered, "before I lose my nerve." So Caleb did. He bent down, and it was a long way down, but he'd never minded the distance less, and kissed her gently, carefully, like she was something precious that might break if handled roughly. Ruth made a small sound against his mouth and kissed him back with a fierceness that belied her size, her scarred hand moving to the back of his neck to hold him close. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ruth laughed. "What?" Caleb asked. "Nothing. Everything." She was smiling so wide it must have hurt. I can't believe it took a rejected mail-order husband to show me what I'd been missing." "What's that?" "Someone who fits," Ruth said simply. "Not despite the scars or the height or the history, but because of all of it. Someone whose broken pieces line up with mine." Standing in the orphanage yard with the bell tower rising behind them and the spring sun warm on their faces, Caleb Thorne finally understood what true acceptance felt like. Not tolerance, not overlooking, but genuine, unconditional acceptance of exactly who he was. It felt like coming home. Spring deepened into early summer, and with it came a shift in how Willow Bend saw Caleb Thorne. The tower stood as a daily reminder that the giant they'd once laughed at had built something beautiful for children who had nothing. People who'd crossed the street to avoid him now nodded hello. Women who'd whispered behind their hands now asked his opinion on their garden fences. Men who'd doubted his skill now sought him out for work they couldn't manage themselves. But it was Ruth's presence beside him that truly changed things. When they walked together through town, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, her head barely reaching his chest, they presented an image that forced reconsideration. Here was Ruth Callahan, whose bravery everyone knew, whose scars everyone had whispered about, choosing this man openly and without apology. If Ruth saw worth in him, perhaps they'd been wrong to see only height. Not everyone came around. Margaret Whitmore still stiffened whenever Caleb entered the general store, still made a show of examining goods on the opposite side whenever he approached. Her friend Constance Porter, a brittle woman with too much money and not enough compassion, had been heard saying that Ruth was settling and that the whole relationship was unseemly given their proportions. "Let them talk," Ruth said one evening as they sat on her porch, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance. "Constance Porter once told me I should be grateful anyone spoke to me after the fire scarred me so badly. She's not someone whose opinion carries weight." "Still," Caleb said, "I don't want to make life harder for you." "You make life better for me," Ruth corrected firmly. "Everything else is just noise." Hugh Morrison's forge had become Caleb's second home. The old smith's arthritis worsened as the weather warmed, a cruel irony that heat, which should have eased his joints, instead seemed to inflame them. More and more, Caleb handled the heavy work while Hugh directed, his experienced eye catching flaws and suggesting improvements. "You're getting better," Hugh said one afternoon, watching Caleb shape a complex hinge for the schoolhouse door. "When you first showed up, you had skill but no artistry. Now you're learning the difference between making something functional and making something fine." "I had a good teacher," Caleb said. "Don't butter me up. I'm too old for flattery and too ornery to appreciate it." But Hugh was smiling as he said it. "I've been thinking, though, about the future, about this forge." Caleb looked up from his work, reading something significant in the old man's tone. "What about it?" "I'm 73 years old. My hands barely work half the time. I've got no children to leave this place to, and when I'm gone, Willow Bend will have no smith." Hugh was quiet for a moment, then continued. "Unless someone takes it over. Someone who knows the work and cares about doing it right." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Caleb set down his hammer carefully, turning to face Hugh directly. "You're offering me the forge?" "I'm offering you a partnership now, with the understanding that it'll be yours when I'm gone. which could be tomorrow or 10 years from now, the way my luck runs. Hugh's blue eyes were sharp despite his age. But I need to know you're staying, that you're not going to build yourself a place here and then drift off to the next town when the mood strikes. This forge has been in operation for 40 years. I won't hand it to someone who'll abandon it. I'm staying, Caleb said without hesitation. I've got reasons to stay. Ruth Callahan being chief among them, I'd wager. Ruth, yes, but not just Ruth. Caleb looked around the forge, at the tools worn smooth by decades of use, at the work waiting to be done. I've been drifting most of my life, Hugh. Always the new man, always temporary, always leaving before I could put down roots. I'm tired of it. I want to build something permanent, and I want to do it here. Hugh studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, decisively. Then we'll draw up papers. Fair split of profits while I'm working, the whole thing yours when I'm not. You'll need to buy the property eventually. I've got a niece in St. Louis who'll inherit, but she's practical. She'll sell it to you at a fair price. They shook hands on it, and Caleb felt another piece of his new life click into place. He had a home now, in the church's back room. He had work that mattered. He had a woman he loved and who loved him back. And now he had a future, solid and real, stretching out before him like an unrolled blueprint. That evening, he told Ruth about Hugh's offer as they worked together in her garden. She'd been teaching him about plants, about which ones needed sun and which preferred shade, about companion planting and the importance of good soil. Caleb found he liked the work, liked the feel of earth under his hands, liked watching things grow from seeds into something substantial. A partnership with Hugh, Ruth said, sitting back on her heels to look at him. That's wonderful, Caleb. It means you're really part of this town now. Not just visiting, but belonging. It feels strange, Caleb admitted. Good, but strange. I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for someone to say it was all a mistake. That's fear talking, Ruth said. She reached over and touched his hand, her fingers leaving dark smudges of earth on his skin. You've spent so long being rejected that acceptance feels suspicious, but this is real. Hugh wouldn't offer if he didn't mean it. The town wouldn't be giving you work if they didn't trust you, and I wouldn't— She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. I wouldn't be planning a future that includes you if I thought you were temporary. Caleb's heart stuttered. A future that includes me? Ruth's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't look away. Yes. A future. Together. I know we haven't talked about it explicitly, but I'm not a young girl who needs a long courtship to know her own mind. I know what I want, and I want you, permanently. If that's something you want too. The garden suddenly felt very quiet. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing, as if waiting for Caleb's response. He set down the trowel he'd been holding and turned to face Ruth fully. Ruth Callahan, he said slowly, are you proposing to me? I'm stating my intentions, Ruth corrected, though there was laughter in her voice. I'm too practical to wait around hoping you'll get to it eventually. Life's short. I already lost one husband to illness. I'm not wasting time being coy about what I want. Well, Caleb found himself laughing, a deep, genuine sound that came from somewhere unguarded inside him. You're remarkable, you know that? I know I'm direct, Ruth said. Does that bother you? It delights me, Caleb said honestly. Everything about you delights me. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his large hand gentle against her face. Yes, I want a future with you. I want it so much I'm afraid to believe it's real. Then stop being afraid, Ruth said simply. Say yes, mean it, and let's start building that future right now. Yes, Caleb said. Yes to everything. To you, to this, to whatever comes next. Ruth smiled, that luminous smile that transformed her entire face, and kissed him there in the garden with dirt on both their hands and the smell of growing things all around them. When they finally pulled apart, she was laughing. What? Caleb asked. I just proposed to a man in my vegetable garden while covered in mud, Ruth said. My mother would be appalled. My mother would have loved you, Caleb replied. She always said the best women were the ones who knew what they wanted and weren't afraid to reach for it. They worked until dark fell, planning not just the garden, but the life they'd grow together. Ruth wanted to expand the cottage, add a room that would serve as Caleb's workshop for small projects he could do at home. Caleb wanted to build her a proper greenhouse so she could extend the growing season. He looked up when they knocked, his face breaking into a warm smile when he saw them together. "Caleb, Ruth, this is a pleasant surprise. Come in, sit down." They settled into the chairs across from his desk, and Caleb noticed they sat close enough that their shoulders touched. Physical proximity that spoke its own truth. "We have news," Ruth began, then glanced at Caleb. "Or rather, we have intentions we'd like to share." Reverend Whitaker set down his pen, giving them his full attention. "I'm listening." "We're planning to marry," Caleb said. The words felt momentous and simple at once. "Nothing formal yet, no specific date. But we wanted you to know, and we'd like you to perform the ceremony when the time comes." The Reverend's smile widened. "I'd be honored, truly honored." He stood and came around the desk to shake Caleb's hand and kiss Ruth's cheek. "This is wonderful news. You're well suited to each other, I think. You've both known hardship and come through it with your integrity intact. That's a solid foundation for a marriage." "We think so too," Ruth said. "When are you thinking? Fall? Winter?" Ruth and Caleb exchanged glances. They hadn't discussed specifics, had been so focused on the decision itself that the details hadn't seemed urgent. "Late summer, maybe," Ruth suggested. "After the harvest, but before the weather turns. That gives us time to prepare properly." "August, then," Reverend Whitaker said. "The 15th is a Saturday. Would that work?" It was roughly 2 months away. 2 months to transform intention into reality, to navigate whatever obstacles would arise, to prepare for the permanent joining of their separate lives into something shared. "The 15th works," Caleb said, looking at Ruth for confirmation. She nodded, her eyes bright. "Then consider it done," the Reverend said. "I'll mark my calendar. And I'll make an announcement on Sunday if you'd like, or we can wait and let you tell people individually." "Announce it," Ruth said firmly. "Let's not give the gossips the satisfaction of breaking the news. We'll do it ourselves, properly, and let people adjust to the idea." Sunday's service felt different to Caleb, charged with anticipation. He sat beside Ruth in their usual pew, aware that by the end of the hour, everyone in Willow Bend would know their plans. It was both thrilling and terrifying, this public claiming of each other. Reverend Whitaker's sermon was about love, not the romantic kind specifically, but the radical act of choosing to see worth in another person. He spoke about how love required courage, required the willingness to be vulnerable, required faith that someone else would handle your heart with care. "And speaking of love," he said, as the sermon drew to a close, "I have a happy announcement to share. 2 members of our community have decided to join their lives in marriage. Caleb Thorne and Ruth Callahan will wed here in this church on Saturday, August 15th, and all are welcome to attend and celebrate with them." The reaction was immediate and varied. Some people smiled and turned to offer congratulations. Others whispered behind their hands, expressions ranging from surprise to disapproval. Martha Boone started clapping, and others joined in, creating a smattering of applause that felt warm despite not being universal. Margaret Whitmore stood abruptly and walked out, her back rigid with what could have been anger or hurt, or simply indignation that the man she'd rejected had found happiness without her. "Let her go," Ruth whispered to Caleb, sensing his attention had followed Margaret's exit. "She made her choice. We're making ours." After the service, they were surrounded by well-wishers. Martha and Samuel Boone congratulated them enthusiastically. Hugh Morrison, who almost never attended church, had made an exception today and gripped Caleb's hand with surprising strength. "About damn time," he said gruffly. "You two have been dancing around each other for months. Good to see you finally made it official." Miss Brennan from the orphanage hugged Ruth tightly. "This is wonderful news. Those children adore Caleb, and they love you. You'll make a beautiful family." The word hung in the air, family. Caleb hadn't thought about it in those terms yet, but Miss Brennan was right. He and Ruth would be a family, small, unconventional perhaps, but real. Not everyone was pleased. Constance Porter approached with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How lovely," she said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. I'm sure you'll be very happy, Ruth. Though I must say it's quite a sudden decision. One might think you're rushing into things. One might mind one's own business, Ruth replied pleasantly. But thank you for your concern, Constance. It's noted and discarded. Constance's smile froze, then shattered. She turned on her heel and stalked away, leaving several nearby parishioners struggling not to laugh. That was unkind, Caleb said, though he was grinning. That was necessary, Ruth corrected. Constance has been needling me for years. It felt good to needle back. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation and work. Caleb continued his partnership with Hugh while also taking on additional commissions. Everyone in town, it seemed, suddenly needed metalwork done. He forged decorative hinges for the hotel, a weather vane for the school, a set of fire tools for Martha Boone that she insisted she needed despite her fireplace working perfectly well. They're buying goodwill, Hugh observed one afternoon. Commissioning work is their way of saying they approve without having to say the words directly. Take the money and the meaning both. Ruth, meanwhile, transformed the cottage. She sewed new curtains for the windows, purchased a larger bed that would actually fit Caleb properly, reorganized her kitchen to make space for 2 people instead of 1. She approached it all with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything, but Caleb could see the joy underneath, the pleasure of preparing a home for someone she loved. They worked together on the cottage expansion, framing out the new room that would serve as Caleb's workshop. It was hard physical labor that left them both exhausted by evening, but there was satisfaction in it. This was their home taking shape under their combined efforts. Every nail driven, every board fitted, was an investment in their shared future. One evening in mid-July, they sat on the cottage porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose. The workshop was nearly finished and the cottage felt transformed, still small but more spacious somehow, as if love had rearranged the very air to make room for both of them. "Are you nervous?" Ruth asked. "About the wedding, I mean." Caleb considered the question. "No. Excited, yes. Impatient, definitely, but not nervous. Are you?" "A little," Ruth admitted. "Not about marrying you, I'm certain about that. But about what comes after. About whether I'll be a good wife. Whether we'll navigate the challenges that come up. Whether—" She trailed off, seeming to struggle with how to continue. "Whether what?" Caleb prompted gently. "Whether you'll still want me when the newness wears off," Ruth said quietly. "When you see me at my worst, when the reality of daily life sets in, when I'm just ordinary." Caleb reached over and took her scarred hand, lacing their fingers together. "Ruth, you could never be ordinary. You ran into a burning building. You climbed a tower despite being terrified of heights. You proposed to me in a garden covered in mud. And even if you did none of those things, even if you were the most ordinary woman in the world, I'd still want you. Because it's not what you do that matters most, it's who you are underneath it all. And who you are is remarkable." Ruth's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You're going to make me cry, and I hate crying." "Then don't," Caleb said. "Just believe me. Trust that I mean what I say, that I'm not going anywhere, that you're stuck with me now." "Good," Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. "Because you're stuck with me too, and I can be quite stubborn when I want to be." "I've noticed," Caleb said dryly, and Ruth laughed, the sound breaking the moment's tension in exactly the right way. The wedding preparations continued. Ruth's dress was simple but beautiful, cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs that she sewed herself. Caleb commissioned a suit from a tailor in Denver who specialized in clothes for unusually sized men, and when it arrived 2 weeks before the wedding, it actually fit. Sleeves long enough, shoulders wide enough, everything proportioned correctly. He stood before Ruth's mirror, trying it on, and barely recognized himself. "You look handsome," Ruth said from the doorway. "Distinguished." "I look like someone pretending to be respectable," Caleb countered. "No, you look like someone who is respectable." Ruth came to stand beside him, adjusting his collar with deft fingers. "You've always been worthy, Caleb. The suit just makes it obvious to people who couldn't see it before." The day before the wedding, Caleb moved his belongings from the church storage room to Ruth's cottage, their cottage now. It didn't take long. He'd accumulated little in his months in Willow Bend. A few changes of clothes, some tools, a handful of books. Everything fit in 2 trips. Reverend Whitaker helped him carry the last load, walking with him through the summer evening to the cottage where Ruth waited. "You've come a long way since that first day," the Reverend observed. "When Ernest brought you to the church, you looked like a man who'd given up hoping for anything good." "I had given up," Caleb admitted. "Or I thought I had. Turns out hope is stubborn. It keeps showing up even when you try to kill it." "That's the nature of hope," Reverend Whitaker said. "It's remarkably hard to extinguish completely, and in your case it was rewarded. You took a risk coming here, and it paid off." "More than paid off," Caleb said. "It changed everything." They reached the cottage to find Ruth waiting on the porch, her face lit with a smile that made Caleb's chest tighten with feeling. This was his life now. This woman, this home, this town. All the years of drifting and rejection and making do with less than he deserved had led him here, to this moment, to this perfect rightness. "Thank you," Caleb said to the Reverend, "for everything. For giving me shelter when I needed it, for believing in me, for helping make this possible." "You made it possible," Reverend Whitaker corrected. "I just provided a room and a little encouragement. Everything else was you." He shook Caleb's hand firmly. "I'll see you tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Try to sleep tonight, though I know you probably won't." He was right. Caleb barely slept, lying in the new, larger bed in what would tomorrow officially become his home, staring at the ceiling and marveling at how dramatically his life had transformed. 6 months ago, he'd been standing on a train platform being laughed at, convinced he'd made a terrible mistake in coming west. Now he had work he valued, friends he respected, and tomorrow he'd marry a woman who saw him completely and loved him anyway. The morning of August 15th dawned clear and hot, the kind of day that promised to be sweltering by afternoon, but started with perfect warmth. Caleb dressed carefully in his new suit, his hands shaking slightly as he worked the buttons. He hadn't been this nervous since... Actually, he couldn't remember ever being this nervous. Even his rejection by Margaret hadn't felt like this. That had been disappointment and embarrassment, but this was different. This was fear of the good kind, the fear that came from knowing you were about to claim something precious and being terrified of somehow failing to deserve it. Hugh arrived at noon to walk with him to the church. The old smith wore his best clothes and a rare smile. "Ready?" he asked. "I've been ready since the day I met her," Caleb said. "I just didn't know it yet." The church was full when they arrived. Martha Boone had organized the decoration, simple arrangements of wildflowers and greenery that made the plain interior feel almost festive. The orphanage children sat in the front row, scrubbed clean and wearing their best clothes, their faces bright with excitement. Miss Brennan kept shushing them, but even she was smiling. Caleb took his place at the altar beside Reverend Whitaker, and the assembled crowd grew quiet. The church door opened, and Ruth appeared. She was beautiful. Not in the elaborate way Margaret Whitmore had been beautiful, all careful arrangement and strategic presentation. Ruth was beautiful the way honest things are beautiful, plainly, truly, without artifice or pretense. Her dress fit her perfectly, her dark hair was pinned up simply, and she carried a small bouquet of garden flowers that Caleb recognized from her own plants. But what made her truly beautiful was the joy in her face, the absolute certainty in her step as she walked toward him. She had no one to give her away. Her parents were long dead. Her aunt had passed the previous winter. So she walked alone down the aisle, and somehow that was perfect. She'd always been self-sufficient, always walked her own path. Why should her wedding be any different? When she reached the altar, Caleb took her hands in his, and the rightness of it nearly overwhelmed him. Here was where he belonged. Here, with this woman who'd chosen him freely, who'd seen all his rough edges and sharp corners and decided he was exactly what she wanted. Reverend Whitaker's ceremony was brief but meaningful. He spoke about the courage it took to commit to another person, about the way marriage required daily choosing, about how the best partnerships were between people who made each other braver. Do you, Caleb Thorne, take Ruth Callahan to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, Caleb said, his voice strong and clear. No hesitation. No doubt. And do you, Ruth Callahan, take Caleb Thorne to be your lawfully wedded husband? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health until death do you part." "I do," Ruth said, squeezing his hands. "Absolutely I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Caleb, you may kiss your bride." Caleb bent down, that familiar distance he'd once hated but now cherished, and kissed Ruth thoroughly while the church erupted in applause and the orphanage children cheered. When they finally broke apart, both smiling so wide it hurt, Reverend Whitaker announced, "May I present Mr. and Mrs. Caleb Thorne?" They walked back down the aisle together hand in hand, while people threw rice and flower petals. Outside, in the bright August sunshine, they were surrounded by well-wishers. Martha Boone cried happy tears. Hugh clapped Caleb on the back hard enough to bruise. The orphanage children mobbed them, hugging both Ruth and Caleb with the unreserved affection of the young. Someone had organized a reception at the town hall, tables laden with food brought by various townspeople, music provided by a local fiddler, decorations that were simple but cheerful. It was modest by city standards, but to Caleb it was perfect. This was his community celebrating with him, accepting him fully into their midst. He danced with Ruth, awkwardly at first because he'd never been graceful, but she laughed and didn't seem to mind when he stepped on her feet. He danced with Martha Boone, with Miss Brennan, even with a few of the bolder orphanage girls who giggled throughout. He ate too much, drank some of the celebratory whiskey that Samuel Boone produced, and felt happier than he could ever remember feeling. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, he and Ruth slipped away from the party, walking hand in hand back toward their cottage, their home. Behind them, they could hear the continued sounds of celebration, music and laughter carrying through the summer air. "We should probably go back," Ruth said, though she made no move to turn around. "It's our party." "They'll manage without us," Caleb replied. "I want to start being married to you, actually married, not just celebrated about being married." Ruth laughed. "Fair point." They reached the cottage as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Inside, everything was familiar but somehow new, the same space transformed by the simple fact that they now officially shared it. Ruth's dress rustled as she moved through the rooms, touching things as if to confirm they were real. The new bed, the expanded kitchen, the workshop that Caleb had built with his own hands. "Are you happy?" Caleb asked, coming to stand behind her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Ruth turned to face him, her gray eyes serious. "I'm happier than I knew how to hope for." "Are you?" "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Caleb said honestly. "When I came to Willow Bend, I thought I was looking for someone who'd accept me despite my height, but you never saw my height as something to overlook. You just saw me, all of me, and you chose that." "I chose you," Ruth corrected. "Not despite anything, not in spite of anything, just you, exactly as you are." She reached up to touch his face, her scarred hand warm against his cheek. "You gave me something too, you know. You gave me permission to stop apologizing for surviving that fire, to stop treating my scars like something shameful. You look at me the way I look at you, seeing everything, accepting all of it." "We're well matched then," Caleb said. "Yes," Ruth agreed. "We are." She kissed him then, and he lifted her easily, carrying her toward the bedroom while she laughed against his mouth. The cottage was small, but it held everything that mattered. Two people who'd found each other against the odds, who'd chosen each other freely, who'd decided that broken pieces could fit together into something whole and beautiful. Outside, the summer evening settled over Willow Bend, warm and peaceful. The orphanage bell tower rose against the darkening sky, its bell silent now but ready to ring when needed. In the town hall, the celebration continued without the bride and groom, their absence hardly noticed in the general joy. And in a small cottage on the eastern edge of town, Caleb and Ruth Thorne began the first night of their married life, two unlikely souls who'd found exactly what they'd been missing in each other. Marriage, Caleb discovered, was both exactly what he'd expected and nothing like it at all. The rhythms of sharing space with Ruth came naturally. She was an early riser. He preferred to work late into the evening, and somehow they met in the middle without friction. She sang while cooking, off-key but cheerful. He had a habit of leaving tools scattered around his workshop that drove her to distraction until she simply designated one corner as his organized chaos zone and refused to comment on it further. They learned each other's patterns and preferences, the thousand small adjustments that two separate lives required to become one shared existence. Ruth took her coffee black and strong. Caleb preferred his with cream and enough sugar that Ruth teased him about drinking candy. She read novels before bed. He fell asleep the moment his head hit the pillow, a skill she envied but couldn't replicate. "You sleep like someone with a clear conscience," she said one night, watching him drift off within minutes of lying down. "I sleep like someone who works hard," Caleb murmured, already half gone. "And who's happy? Happy people sleep easy." It was true. For the first time in his adult life, Caleb wasn't lying awake cataloging his failures or planning his next escape. He was simply present, rooted, home. The partnership with Hugh Morrison flourished as summer gave way to fall. They established a comfortable division of labor. Caleb handled the heavy forging and the jobs that required strength, while Hugh focused on the detailed finish work and design consultations. His arthritis made gripping hammers painful, but his eye for beauty and function remained sharp as ever. "You've got the skill," Hugh told Caleb one crisp October morning as they worked on a commissioned gate for the schoolyard. "But I've got the vision. Together we make one excellent smith." The gate was ambitious. Wrought iron worked into patterns of vines and leaves, functional but beautiful. It was the kind of work that would last generations, and Caleb approached it with the reverence such projects deserved. Every joint had to be perfect, every weld had to be invisible, every curve had to flow naturally into the next. Ruth came by the forge that afternoon carrying lunch wrapped in cloth. She'd developed a habit of bringing him food, claiming he'd forget to eat otherwise, which was probably true. He got lost in the work sometimes, hours passing without notice, until his stomach reminded him forcefully that bodies needed fuel. "That's coming along beautifully," she said, studying the partially completed gate. "The children will love having something so special." "It's for them and for us," Caleb said, accepting the sandwich she offered. "Every piece of good work we put into this town is an investment in our future here, and making Willow Bend the kind of place people want to stay." "Spoken like a man who's planning to be here a long time," Hugh observed. "Forever, if I have my way," Caleb replied, looking at Ruth. She smiled that small, private smile that was just for him, and something warm settled in his chest. The first real test of their marriage came in late October, when Ruth received a letter from her late husband's brother in Kansas City. James Callahan had never been particularly close to his brother, or to Ruth, but he'd recently learned of her remarriage and had thoughts about it. Ruth read the letter at the kitchen table, her expression growing increasingly tight. When she finished, she set it down with a careful precision that suggested she wanted to crumple it into a ball instead. "Bad news?" Caleb asked, looking up from the harness buckle he'd been repairing. "Family nonsense," Ruth said, then sighed. "James is concerned about my hasty remarriage to someone he's never met. He's suggesting I may have been taken advantage of, that perhaps I should reconsider, that a proper mourning period for his brother should have lasted longer." "It's been 4 years since your husband died," Caleb said carefully. "I'm aware. James is apparently less aware, or less concerned with facts than with appearances." Ruth picked up the letter again, scanning it with visible irritation. "He's also concerned about the financial implications, which is rich considering he never offered any support when I actually needed it." Caleb set down his work and moved to sit beside her. "Do you need to respond?" "I should probably send something," Ruth said, if only to tell him to mind his own business in the politest terms possible. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "Does it bother you that people question our marriage?" "Some people will always question," Caleb said. "Margaret Whitmore still acts like I'm some kind of mistake she narrowly avoided. Constance Porter looks at us like we're a curiosity, but their opinions don't change what we have. They don't make it less real." "No, they don't," Ruth agreed. She reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I just hate that people assume I'm not capable of making my own decisions, that I must have been manipulated or rushed or confused, as if I'm not a grown woman with a perfectly functional brain." "Write him back," Caleb suggested. "Tell him you're happy, that I'm treating you well, and that his concern, while noted, is unnecessary. Kill him with courtesy." Ruth laughed despite her frustration. "Kill him with courtesy. I like that." She pulled out paper and pen and began drafting a response, reading parts aloud as she went. Caleb listened and offered suggestions, and together they crafted a letter that was polite but firm, gracious, but unbending. By the time Ruth sealed it, she looked satisfied rather than angry. "Thank you," she said, "for not making this weird. Some men would be offended or defensive." "Some men are idiots," Caleb replied. "I'm trying not to be one of them." "You're succeeding," Ruth said, and kissed him soundly. November brought the first serious snow, heavy wet flakes that buried the town in white and turned roads into treacherous mud. Caleb spent 2 days helping dig out neighbors who'd gotten snowed in, his height and strength making him particularly useful for reaching roofs that needed clearing. Ruth worked with Martha Boone and other women organizing food deliveries to elderly residents who couldn't venture out safely. It was the kind of community response that Caleb had heard about but never experienced personally. Everyone pitching in because that's what you did, because your neighbor's well-being was your well-being. In cities, he'd noticed, people could starve 10 feet from plenty because nobody knew their names. But in Willow Bend, everybody knew everybody, for better and worse. The gossip could be suffocating, but the support in hard times was real and immediate. One afternoon, while helping Samuel Boone clear snow from the general store roof, Caleb looked out across the town and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just where he lived anymore. This was home in a way nowhere else had ever been. These people, with all their flaws and judgments, were his people. This place, with its harsh winters and small-town complications, was his place. "You've got that look," Samuel said, following his gaze. "What look?" "The look of a man who's realized he belongs somewhere." Samuel drove his shovel into the snowbank. "I had the same look when I married Martha, and we decided to stay in Willow Bend instead of moving to Denver like we'd planned. It's the look of putting down roots so deep they'll never pull up." "That obvious?" Caleb asked. "To anyone paying attention, yes." Samuel clapped him on the shoulder. "It's a good look. Wear it well." The Christmas season brought new challenges. Ruth wanted to host a dinner for friends, but the cottage was small and Caleb was large, which created spatial mathematics that seemed impossible. "We'll make it work," Ruth insisted, already planning the menu. "Martha and Samuel, Hugh, Reverend Whitaker, maybe Miss Brennan, and a few of the older orphanage children. We'll squeeze in." "Squeeze is right," Caleb said, eyeing their modest dining table. "I take up the space of 2 regular people. We'll need to figure out seating." They solved it by borrowing benches from the church and arranging everything buffet style so people could eat wherever they found space. On Christmas Eve, their cottage filled with laughter and conversation. People perched on every available surface, sharing food and stories and warmth. The orphanage children were wide-eyed at the abundance, and Caleb made sure they ate until they couldn't hold another bite. "This is what Christmas should be," Reverend Whitaker said, watching the children devour Ruth's gingerbread. "Not fancy or formal, just people caring for each other?" "Agreed," Hugh said, raising his cup of cider. "To Caleb and Ruth, and to homes that make space for everyone." They drank to that, and Caleb felt the truth of it settle over him like a benediction. This was what he'd been searching for all those years of drifting. Not just acceptance, but belonging. Not just tolerance, but genuine welcome. A place where his presence added something rather than subtracted from everyone else's comfort. Late that night, after everyone had gone and they'd cleaned up the remnants of the celebration, Ruth and Caleb sat by the fire watching the flames dance. "That was good," Ruth said, leaning against his shoulder. "Really good." "It was perfect," Caleb agreed, "though I'm not sure how we managed to fit 12 people in this cottage." "Love makes spaces bigger," Ruth said, "or maybe it just makes us care less about being cramped." "Philosopher Ruth Thorne," Caleb teased gently. "It's the cider talking," Ruth admitted, "but I mean it anyway. When I was alone here, this cottage felt huge and empty. Now with you, it feels exactly the right size, even when we're hosting half the town." Winter settled in hard after Christmas, bringing temperatures that made even the forge fire feel inadequate. Caleb worked bundled in layers, his breath misting in the cold air, but the work had to continue. People needed horseshoes, needed repairs, needed tools that only a skilled smith could provide. Hugh's arthritis worsened in the cold, leaving Caleb to handle most of the physical labor, while Hugh managed the business side and did what finish work his hands could tolerate. "I'm becoming useless," Hugh said one particularly bitter January morning, flexing his fingers painfully. "You're becoming wise," Caleb corrected. "There's a difference. I can hammer metal, but I can't price jobs fairly or know which clients will pay promptly and which will try to haggle." That's all you. Diplomatic, Hugh said, but I know my limitations. Another year, maybe two, and I'll be done with forge work entirely. You'll be on your own. Then I'll hire an apprentice, Caleb said. Someone young and strong who can learn the trade properly. Maybe that Daniel kid, if he's interested. He's got good hands. Hugh perked up at that. Daniel Peterson? Jack's son? He'd be a good choice. Smart boy. Eager. I'll talk to him, Caleb said. After winter. Right now I'm just focused on not freezing to death between here and home. The cold forced Caleb and Ruth into even closer quarters than usual. They spent evenings huddled by the fire, Ruth reading while Caleb worked on small projects that didn't require the forge. He'd taken to carving wood in his spare time, a hobby that surprised him with how much he enjoyed it. There was something meditative about shaving away everything that wasn't necessary, revealing the form hiding inside the raw material. He made Ruth a jewelry box with a false bottom for storing precious things. He carved a set of toys for the orphanage children, horses and wagons and dolls that he sanded until they were smooth as silk. He made a walking stick for Reverend Whitaker with intricate knotwork in the handle. Each piece was a gift, a way of saying thank you to the people who'd made space for him in their lives. You're good at this, Ruth observed one evening, watching him work on a decorative panel that would eventually be part of a hope chest he was building. Have you always carved? My father taught me when I was young, Caleb said, carefully cutting a leaf pattern into the wood. Said a man should be able to make beautiful things with his hands, not just functional ones. I forgot about it for a while, got too focused on smithing. But it's coming back. I'm glad, Ruth said. You have gentleness in you that the forge work doesn't always let you express. This does. It was an astute observation, and it made Caleb pause in his work to look at her properly. She was knitting something, a scarf maybe, or a blanket, her scarred hand managing the needles with the same competence it brought to everything else. She taught herself to compensate for the stiffness, to work around the limitations the burn had imposed. It was just one more example of her quiet strength, her refusal to let circumstances define what she could accomplish. What? She asked, noticing his gaze. Nothing. Just thinking about how lucky I am. We're lucky, Ruth corrected. Both of us. We found each other when we'd both stopped looking. That's not luck. That's something better. That's fate, maybe. Or grace. I'll take either, Caleb said, returning to his carving. February brought a crisis that tested the community in ways they hadn't anticipated. Influenza swept through Willow Bend, laying low young and old alike. The doctor, an elderly man who'd been considering retirement, worked himself to exhaustion trying to treat everyone. Ruth volunteered to help, her experience nursing her first husband through his final illness, making her invaluable. Caleb worried every time she left the cottage to tend the sick. Influenza killed indiscriminately, and the thought of losing her to disease after everything they'd built together was almost more than he could bear. But Ruth was adamant. I have to help, she said, packing supplies for another day of nursing. These are our neighbors, our friends. I can't just hide at home because I'm afraid. I know, Caleb said, though his stomach clenched with anxiety. Just be careful, please. I will. And you be careful too. Don't visit anyone sick unless absolutely necessary. I can't nurse you and everyone else. The epidemic lasted 3 weeks. 4 people died, including one of the orphanage children, a little girl named Emma who'd been at their Christmas dinner laughing over gingerbread. The town mourned collectively, the grief all the sharper for being shared. Caleb built Emma's coffin, making it beautiful because she'd deserved beauty in her short life. He carved flowers into the lid and sanded it until it gleamed, working through tears he didn't bother to hide. Ruth came home exhausted every night, collapsing into bed without even eating sometimes. Caleb made sure there was hot food waiting, made sure she bathed to wash away the sickness she'd been exposed to, made sure she knew she wasn't alone in carrying the weight of the town's suffering. Too many people are dying, she said one night, her voice hollow with fatigue. I do everything I can and it's not enough. Emma was 7 years old, Caleb, 7. She should have had a lifetime ahead of her. Caleb held her while she cried, her tears soaking his shirt, her body shaking with exhaustion and grief. There were no words adequate to the moment, so he didn't try to find them. He just held her, solid and present, letting her break against him knowing he wouldn't break in return. When the epidemic finally passed, the town gathered for a memorial service. Reverend Whitaker spoke about loss and resilience, about how communities grew stronger through shared suffering if they let it unite them rather than divide them. The church was packed, everyone needing to grieve together to acknowledge that they'd survived something terrible. After the service, multiple people approached Ruth to thank her for her tireless nursing. Some people who'd previously been cool toward her, who'd judged her for her scars or her hasty remarriage, now looked at her with respect bordering on reverence. She'd proven herself in the most fundamental way possible, risking her own health to care for theirs. "You're a hero," Martha Boone said, hugging Ruth tightly. "We won't forget what you did." "I just did what needed doing," Ruth said, uncomfortable with the praise. "That's what heroes always say," Martha replied. The spring of their first anniversary brought new growth, both literal and metaphorical. Ruth's garden exploded with life as the weather warmed, and Caleb finished the greenhouse he'd been building, a structure of wood and glass that would let her grow things year-round. She cried when she saw it completed, running her hands over the smooth wood, testing the hinges on the door. "It's perfect," she said. "Caleb, I don't have words." "You taught me about growing things," Caleb said. "Seemed only fair to give you the space to do it properly." They planted together that spring, filling the greenhouse with seedlings and the garden with everything from tomatoes to herbs to flowers that served no purpose except beauty. Caleb discovered he enjoyed the work, the feel of dirt under his hands, the satisfaction of watching things grow from tiny seeds into substantial plants. It was different from smithing, but related somehow, both requiring patience and attention and faith that your efforts would produce results. Hugh officially announced his retirement in April, though he continued to come by the forge most days to supervise and offer advice. True to Caleb's prediction, Daniel Peterson signed on as an apprentice, bringing youthful energy and genuine interest to the work. The boy was tall himself, though not as tall as Caleb, and he asked thoughtful questions about technique and process. "He reminds me of myself at that age," Caleb told Ruth one evening. "Eager to learn, willing to work hard, just hoping someone will give him a chance." "You're giving him more than a chance," Ruth said. "You're giving him a future. That matters." The forge thrived under the new arrangement. Caleb handled the major projects and trained Daniel in the fundamentals, while Hugh managed the business and occasionally did light finish work when his hands permitted. They were making money, enough that Caleb could begin seriously considering purchasing the property from Hugh's niece. The future he'd once thought impossible was becoming increasingly real and tangible. Their first anniversary fell on August 15th, a year to the day since they'd married. Ruth wanted to celebrate simply, just the two of them, so they packed a picnic and climbed to a spot in the foothills where they could look down on Willow Bend spread out below. "A year," Ruth said, leaning against Caleb's shoulder as they watched the town go about its business. "It feels longer somehow, like we've always been together." "Good longer or bad longer?" Caleb asked. "Good longer. The best longer." She turned to look at him. "I was so lonely before you came. I didn't even realize how lonely until I wasn't anymore. You filled spaces in my life I didn't know were empty." "You did the same for me," Caleb said. "More than the same. You gave me a reason to believe I could have this. A home, a marriage, a place to belong. I'd stopped believing in any of that." "Margaret Whitmore's loss was definitely my gain," Ruth said lightly, though there was steel underneath the humor. "I should probably write her a thank you note. Dear Margaret, thank you for being too small-minded to see what you were giving up. Signed, the happiest woman in Colorado." Caleb laughed. "Please don't actually send that." "I won't, but I'll think it very loudly whenever I see her." Ruth pulled out the picnic lunch she'd packed, sandwiches and fruit, and a small cake she'd made that morning. "I have something for you, an anniversary gift." She handed him a wrapped package, and Caleb opened it carefully to find a leather journal, the cover embossed with his initials. Inside, the first page bore an inscription in Ruth's careful handwriting. "For Caleb Thorne, who builds beautiful things and makes space for everyone. May this journal hold all the plans and dreams yet to come." "Ruth, this is..." Caleb struggled with the emotion rising in his throat. "This is perfect. Thank you." "I thought you could use it for sketches and plans," Ruth explained. "For all the projects you're always designing in your head. Now you'll have a place to put them. Caleb had a gift for her too, something he'd been working on in secret for months. He pulled out a wooden box carved with vines and flowers that matched the ones in her garden. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a necklace he'd forged from silver, a simple chain with a pendant shaped like a small house. "Because you gave me a home," Caleb said as Ruth lifted the necklace from the box with shaking hands. "The first real home I've ever had. I wanted you to have something that reminded you what you mean to me." Ruth was crying as he fastened the necklace around her neck, the little house pendant settling just above her heart. "I love it. I love you. God, Caleb, I love you so much." "I love you too," Caleb said, and kissed her there on the mountainside with Willow Bend spread out below them and their whole future stretching ahead like an open road. They stayed until sunset, talking about everything and nothing, making plans for the year ahead. They wanted to expand the cottage further, add another room for the children they hoped to have. Ruth wanted to start selling her produce at the new farmers market the town was organizing. Caleb wanted to take on more ambitious commissions, maybe even enter some of his work in the county fair. These were the dreams of people who expected to stay, who believed in their future together, who'd stopped bracing for disaster and learned to trust in good fortune. As they packed up to head back down the mountain, Ruth paused to look at the town once more. The lamps were being lit in windows, creating constellations of light in the growing darkness. Smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere down there, people were sitting down to dinner, children were being put to bed. Life was continuing in its ordinary, extraordinary way. "Do you ever think about that day at the station?" Ruth asked. "When Margaret rejected you?" "Sometimes," Caleb admitted. "But not with anger anymore. More with gratitude, strange as that sounds. If she'd accepted me, I never would have met you. I'd be stuck in some unhappy marriage with a woman who resented my existence. Instead, I'm here with you, happier than I knew I could be." "Everything works out the way it's supposed to," Ruth said. "That's what my aunt used to tell me. I never believed her until now." They walked down the mountain hand in hand, two people who'd been broken and rejected and measured and found wanting by others, but who'd measured each other and found everything they needed. Behind them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Ahead, the lights of Willow Bend beckoned them home. And between them ran a connection so strong that nothing could break it. Not judgment, not gossip, not the cruelties of small minds or the challenges of daily life. They'd found each other against the odds. They'd built something beautiful together. And they were just getting started. The second year of their marriage brought changes that neither of them had anticipated, starting with Ruth's announcement one September morning that she was pregnant. She said it quietly over breakfast, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if needing something solid to hold on to. "You're sure?" Caleb asked, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "As sure as I can be without seeing the doctor, but yes, I'm sure. I know my own body." Ruth looked up at him, searching his face. "Are you happy about it?" Caleb set down his fork carefully and came around the table to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. I'm terrified and thrilled and completely overwhelmed, all at the same time." "Good," Ruth said, laughing shakily, "because that's exactly how I feel too." They told no one for the first few months, keeping the knowledge between them like a precious secret. Ruth continued her work in the garden and around town, though Caleb found himself watching her more carefully, worried about her lifting heavy things or overexerting herself. She tolerated his concern with patient amusement until it crossed into hovering, at which point she firmly told him to stop treating her like she was made of glass. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she said one afternoon when he'd tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of vegetables. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. I can manage a few carrots." "I know, I know you worry," Ruth interrupted gently, "and I love you for it. But you need to trust that I know my limits. I'll ask for help when I need it." Caleb forced himself to back off, though it went against every protective instinct he possessed. The thought of something happening to Ruth, or the baby, kept him awake some nights, staring at the ceiling and cataloging all the ways pregnancy could go wrong. But Ruth slept peacefully beside him, her hand often resting on her stomach even in sleep, and her calm helped steady him. They announced the pregnancy in November, just before Thanksgiving, and the news spread through Willow Bend with the speed of all good gossip. Martha Boone immediately began organizing, declaring that Ruth would need help and support, and that the women of the town would make sure she had it. Miss Brennan started knitting baby clothes with the older orphanage girls. Even Reverend Whitaker got involved, mentioning in his Sunday sermon how blessed the community was to be welcoming new life. The outpouring of support surprised Caleb with its genuineness. These weren't just polite gestures. People truly seemed invested in Ruth's well-being and excited about the baby. It was another reminder of how fully they'd been accepted into the fabric of Willow Bend, how completely their presence had been woven into the community's story. The exception, as always, was Margaret Whitmore. She said nothing about the pregnancy directly, but Caleb overheard her telling Constance Porter that it was rather improper how quickly Ruth had gotten in the family way, and that one hoped the child wouldn't inherit unfortunate proportions from the father. Ruth, when Caleb relayed this to her, laughed until tears ran down her face. Unfortunate proportions, as if height is a curse. God, that woman is ridiculous. She bothers you less than she used to, Caleb observed. Because I have everything she doesn't, Ruth said simply. I have love, real love, the kind that doesn't care about proportions or propriety. She has her pride and her judgments and her perfectly proportioned loneliness. I'll take what I have, thanks. Winter came hard again, but this time Caleb had made preparations. He'd insulated the cottage better, laid in extra firewood, made sure the greenhouse was secure against the cold. Ruth moved through her pregnancy with surprising ease, her body adapting to the changes with a resilience that matched everything else about her. She grew rounder through December and January, her dresses letting out as far as they could go until Martha Boone brought over maternity clothes that had belonged to her daughter. Sarah's married now and living in Kansas, Martha explained. She won't need these again. Ruth might as well get use from them. The women of Willow Bend took turns checking on Ruth, bringing food and company, making sure she wasn't isolated during the long winter months. It was the same kind of community care they'd shown during the influenza epidemic, that fundamental understanding that you looked after your own. Ruth bloomed under the attention, her face glowing with more than just pregnancy as she received the kind of female friendship she'd been missing since her aunt's death. Caleb threw himself into preparing for the baby's arrival. He built a cradle from carefully selected wood, carving it with protective symbols and blessing words he'd learned from his father. He made sure the cottage was safe, covering sharp corners and securing anything that could fall. He expanded their savings, taking on extra work even though it meant longer hours, because he wanted Ruth to have everything she needed. Daniel had proven to be an excellent apprentice, skilled enough now that Caleb could trust him with more complex work. The boy had grown into his height over the past year, his movements gaining the confidence that came from mastering a difficult craft. He reminded Caleb of himself at that age, except Daniel had something Caleb hadn't, the certainty of belonging, the knowledge that he had a place in the world that valued his contributions. "You're a good teacher," Hugh told Caleb one afternoon in late February, watching Daniel work on a complicated hinge design. "Better than I was, probably. You remember what it was like to be uncertain, to need guidance instead of just instruction. That makes a difference." "I had good teachers," Caleb replied, "including you." "I taught you smithing," Hugh said, "but you taught yourself how to live. That's harder and more important." March brought the first hints of spring and a scare that aged Caleb 10 years in a single afternoon. Ruth had been working in the greenhouse, preparing seedlings for the coming growing season, when she suddenly doubled over in pain. Caleb heard her cry out from his workshop and ran, his heart in his throat, to find her gripping the work table and breathing hard. "The baby," she gasped. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." He carried her to the cottage and sent Daniel running for the doctor, then stayed beside Ruth while she fought through waves of pain that seemed to go on forever. The doctor, when he finally arrived, examined her thoroughly and announced that it was false labor, not uncommon in the final months of pregnancy, but that Ruth needed complete bed rest for at least a week. "No gardening, no housework, no exertion of any kind," the doctor said firmly. "You've been doing too much, Mrs. Thorne. Your body is telling you to slow down. I suggest you listen." Ruth chafed at the restriction, but Caleb was ruthless in enforcing it. He took over all the household tasks, cooking and cleaning with varying degrees of success, and delegated his forge work to Daniel as much as possible so he could stay close to home. Martha Boone organized a rotation of women to sit with Ruth during the day, keeping her company and making sure she didn't try to do too much. I feel useless, Ruth complained one afternoon, watching from her bed as Caleb attempted to fold laundry. And you're terrible at that. Those sheets are going to be wrinkled beyond salvation. Then they'll be wrinkled, Caleb said. I care more about you and the baby than I do about wrinkled sheets. I know. But watching you struggle is almost worse than being stuck in bed. She paused, her hand moving to her belly. The baby's moving. Come feel. Caleb set down the laundry and sat beside her on the bed, placing his large hand where she directed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he felt it. A small but definite push against his palm, like the baby was saying hello. That's our child, Ruth said softly. That's a whole person in there, Caleb. A person we made together. The enormity of it hit Caleb with unexpected force. He'd known intellectually that Ruth was pregnant, that they were going to be parents, but feeling that tiny movement made it real in a way nothing else had. There was a person growing inside Ruth, a person who would have his features and hers, who would need them and depend on them, and eventually grow up to become their own complete individual. I'm terrified, he admitted. What if I'm not good enough? What if I don't know how to be a father? Then we'll figure it out together, Ruth said. Same as we figured out everything else. Neither of us had perfect childhoods or perfect examples, but we have each other and we have love, and that's more than some people start with. When did you get so wise? Caleb asked. Bed rest gives you a lot of time to think, Ruth said, and I've been thinking about how much we've both changed since we met. You're not the rejected mail-order husband standing alone on a train platform anymore. I'm not the lonely widow hiding in her garden. We've become something better together. I have to believe we'll do the same as parents. April brought warm weather and Ruth's release from bed rest. She emerged from the cottage like a prisoner freed from jail, standing in her garden and breathing deep lungfuls of spring air while Caleb watched nervously in case she overexerted herself. But she was careful now, mindful of her limitations, doing light work and asking for help when she needed it. The baby was due in early May, according to the doctor's calculations, but May 1st came and went with no sign of labor beginning. May 5th passed, then May 10th. Ruth grew increasingly uncomfortable as the baby seemed in no hurry to make an appearance, her back aching and her sleep disturbed by the sheer physical awkwardness of being so heavily pregnant. I'm going to be pregnant forever, she said on May 12th, shifting position for the 100th time trying to get comfortable. This baby is never coming out. I'm going to be enormous and miserable for the rest of my life. The baby will come when it's ready, Caleb said, though he was getting worried himself. The doctor said it could be any day now. The doctor has been saying that for 2 weeks, Ruth grumbled. I'm starting to think he doesn't actually know anything. Labor finally began on May 15th, at 3 in the morning when sensible people were sleeping. Ruth woke Caleb with a hand on his shoulder and a calm announcement that her water had broken and the contractions were starting. Caleb, who'd been so certain he'd remain calm when the moment came, immediately panicked. He stumbled out of bed, lit 3 lamps when one would have sufficed, couldn't find his boots, even though they were right where he'd left them, and generally proved that preparation and actual competence were 2 different things. Caleb, Ruth said, her voice cutting through his panic, I need you to breathe. Can you do that for me? Just breathe. He breathed. It helped. He got the doctor, got Martha Boone, who'd agreed to assist with the birth, got everything set up the way they'd planned. And then there was nothing to do but wait while Ruth labored through the long hours of bringing new life into the world. Childbirth, Caleb discovered, was both exactly as terrifying as he'd imagined and somehow worse. Ruth was in pain, real pain that he couldn't fix or take away, and all he could do was hold her hand and tell her she was doing beautifully while she cursed him for getting her pregnant in the first place. Martha Boone seemed to find his distress amusing, patting his arm and assuring him that all first-time fathers looked like they were going to faint. She's doing wonderfully, Martha told him during a brief respite between contractions. Strong and determined, just like everything else she does. The baby will be here soon. Soon turned out to be another 6 hours. The sun was well up and the town fully awake when Ruth gave one final monumental push and their daughter entered the world, tiny and furious and absolutely perfect. The doctor caught her expertly, cleared her airway, and handed the squalling infant to Martha to clean while he tended to Ruth. Caleb stood frozen, staring at the tiny red-faced creature who was his daughter, and felt every certainty he'd ever had rearrange itself around this new central truth. He was a father. That was his child. Nothing in his life would ever be the same or matter quite as much as making sure this small person was safe and loved and given every opportunity to thrive. "Do you want to hold her?" Martha asked, approaching with the now swaddled baby. "Meet your daughter properly?" Caleb nodded, not trusting his voice, and held out his arms. Martha placed the baby in them with the confident ease of someone who'd done this many times, adjusting his hold to make sure he supported the head properly. The baby was so small, so impossibly light in his arms, and yet she felt like the entire world condensed into one fragile bundle. "Hello," he whispered, looking down into his daughter's scrunched face. "Hello, little one. I'm your father, and I'm going to do everything I can to be worthy of that." The baby opened her eyes, dark blue and unfocused, and seemed to look right at him. Caleb felt something in his chest crack open, felt love pour through the fracture in a flood that threatened to drown him. This was his daughter, his child, the physical proof that he and Ruth had built something lasting and true. "Caleb," Ruth said weakly from the bed, "let me see her. Let me see our daughter." He carried the baby to Ruth, placing her carefully in his wife's arms, and watched as Ruth gazed down at their child with an expression of such complete wonder that Caleb had to look away before he started crying in front of everyone. "She's perfect," Ruth said, her finger tracing the baby's cheek. "Look what we made, Caleb. Look at her." "What are you naming her?" Martha asked. They'd discussed names endlessly over the past months, debating options and meanings, but in the end, the choice was obvious. Ruth looked at Caleb, and he nodded. "Emma?" Ruth said. "Emma Grace Thorne, for the little girl we lost in the epidemic, and for the grace that brought us together." "It's a beautiful name," Martha said, wiping at her eyes. Emma would have been honored. Word of the baby's birth spread through Willow Bend with characteristic speed. By afternoon, people began arriving with gifts, blankets and clothes and toys, food for the new parents, flowers for Ruth. The cottage filled with well-wishers, all wanting to meet little Emma and congratulate the Thornes on their new arrival. Even Reverend Whitaker came, holding the baby with the practiced ease of someone who'd blessed many infants, and pronouncing her a miracle worth celebrating. The orphanage children arrived in a carefully supervised group, their faces awestruck as they got to see a real baby up close. Thomas Chen, now 9 years old and sturdy with health, asked if he could hold her, and Caleb carefully placed Emma in the boy's arms under close supervision. "She's so little," Thomas said, his voice filled with wonder. "Was I ever this little?" "You were," Miss Brennan confirmed. "All babies are little. They grow surprisingly fast, though." The only person who didn't come to visit or send congratulations was Margaret Whitmore. Caleb tried not to care, tried to tell himself that her opinion didn't matter, but some small part of him still felt the sting of her original rejection. She'd looked at him and seen only his height, had deemed him unworthy without bothering to know him. And now he had everything, a wife who loved him, a daughter who was perfect, a place in a community that valued him. Margaret had her pride and her perfect proportions, and nothing else. "Stop thinking about her," Ruth said that evening, after everyone had finally gone and they were alone with Emma. "I can tell when you're thinking about Margaret because you get this particular expression, like you've bitten into something sour." "How do you know I was thinking about her?" "Because she's the only person in Willow Bend who didn't acknowledge Emma's birth," Ruth said. "And because you're human, and humans notice when they're snubbed even when they know they shouldn't care." "I shouldn't care," Caleb admitted. "But you're right, I do. Some part of me still wants her to see that she was wrong about me." "She was wrong about you," Ruth said firmly. "But her being wrong doesn't require her acknowledgement. You know your worth now. I know it. Emma will know it. Margaret's opinion is irrelevant." "When did you get so wise?" Caleb asked for the second time in as many months. "Childbirth gives you perspective," Ruth replied. "When you've pushed a whole person out of your body, other people's judgments seem fairly trivial." They fell into the exhausting rhythm of new parenthood, the endless cycle of feeding and changing and soothing a tiny creature who had no concept of day or night. Caleb had never been so tired in his life, But he'd also never been so filled with purpose. Every time Emma cried and he managed to soothe her, every time she gripped his finger with her tiny hand, every time she looked at him with her unfocused baby gaze, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The forge work suffered somewhat as Caleb tried to balance his responsibilities. Daniel stepped up magnificently, handling more of the daily work and only consulting Caleb on complex projects or difficult decisions. Hugh, whose health had been declining, rarely came to the forge anymore, but he sent messages of advice and encouragement through his neighbor. "Tell Caleb not to worry about the forge," Hugh's latest message read. "Babies are more important than ironwork. The metal will wait, children grow too fast." It was good advice, and Caleb tried to follow it. But money was tight with the extra expenses of a new baby, and he felt the pressure to provide, to make sure Ruth and Emma had everything they needed. He took on work he probably should have refused, stayed at the forge later than he should have, pushed himself harder than was wise. Ruth noticed, of course. She noticed everything. "You're exhausted," she said one evening, watching him stumble through the door well after dark. "Caleb, you can't keep doing this. You're going to make yourself sick." "We need the money," Caleb said. "Emma needs clothes and the cradle needs a proper mattress, and you wanted to get that medicine the doctor recommended. And none of that matters if you collapse from exhaustion," Ruth interrupted. "We'll manage. We've managed through worse than tight finances, but I can't manage without you." Her words cut through his fatigue-fogged thinking. She was right, of course. He was trying so hard to provide that he was neglecting what actually mattered, being present, being healthy, being the husband and father his family needed him to be. "I'm sorry," he said. "I just want to give you everything, both of you. I want Emma to have the childhood I didn't, where money isn't always tight, and there's always enough." "Emma will have something better than money," Ruth said. "She'll have parents who love her and each other, who model what a good marriage looks like, who teach her that worth isn't measured in dollars or height or any other external metric. That's more valuable than any amount of money." Caleb pulled Ruth close, careful of Emma sleeping between them, and let himself feel the truth of what they'd built. This was his family, his home, his life. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Summer came with its long days and abundant growth. Ruth's garden flourished, producing more vegetables than they could possibly eat themselves. She started selling the surplus at the farmer's market that had finally gotten organized, and discovered she had a talent for it. People liked buying from her, trusted her knowledge about plants and growing things, and she began to develop a small but loyal customer base. Emma grew with the shocking speed of all babies, changing almost daily. By July, she was smiling. By August, she was laughing, a bright gurgling sound that made both Caleb and Ruth stop whatever they were doing just to hear it. She was alert and curious, her dark blue eyes tracking movement, her tiny hands reaching for everything within grasp. "She's going to be tall," Ruth observed one afternoon, holding Emma up and noting how long she was getting. "Look at those legs. She takes after you." "God help her," Caleb said, but he was smiling. The thought of Emma being tall didn't fill him with the dread he might have expected. Maybe she would be tall. Maybe she would face some of the same challenges he had. But she'd have something he hadn't, parents who understood, who would teach her from the beginning that her height was just one aspect of who she was, neither a curse nor a defining characteristic. The harvest fair in September brought the whole town together in celebration of another successful growing season. Ruth entered some of her produce and won second place for her tomatoes, which she claimed was more exciting than first place would have been because it meant she still had room to improve. Caleb entered the gate he and Daniel had made for the schoolyard, and it won first place in the metalwork category, a blue ribbon that Daniel proudly insisted on displaying in the forge. They walked through the fair as a family, Caleb, Ruth, and Emma, bundled in a sling against Ruth's chest, and felt the weight of belonging settle over them like a benediction. People called out greetings, stopped to admire Emma, asked about the forge and the garden and their plans for the future. This was community in its truest form, not just proximity, but genuine connection, shared investment in each other's well-being and success. Even Margaret Whitmore was there, standing near the baked goods competition with Constance Porter. For the first time since Caleb had arrived in Willow Bend, their paths crossed directly with no way to avoid each other. They stood awkwardly for a moment, the past hanging between them like smoke. Then Margaret did something Caleb never expected. She looked at Emma, really looked at her, and her face softened into something almost wistful. "She's beautiful," Margaret said quietly. "Your daughter. She's beautiful." "Thank you," Ruth said when Caleb seemed unable to speak. "We think so too." "I was wrong," Margaret continued, and the words seemed to cost her something to say. "That day at the station, I was wrong about many things. I see that now." She didn't apologize, not exactly, but the admission was as close as someone like Margaret Whitmore could probably come to acknowledging a mistake. Caleb found he didn't need a formal apology. The vindication of Margaret seeing what she'd given up was enough. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "It means something." Margaret nodded once, then walked away, her back straight, but somehow less rigid than it had been. Constance Porter followed, but not before shooting Ruth a look that might have been respect, or might have been envy, or might have been both. "Well," Ruth said as they continued through the fair, "that was unexpected." "Life keeps surprising me," Caleb said. "I've stopped trying to predict what comes next and just started appreciating what's here." "That's very philosophical for someone who works with metal," Ruth teased. "Metal teaches you about transformation," Caleb said, "how things can be remade into something better. I'm living proof of that." As autumn deepened and the days grew shorter, the Thorne family settled into a comfortable routine. Caleb worked at the forge during the day, often bringing Emma with him in her basket, where she could sleep to the rhythmic sounds of hammer on anvil. Ruth managed the house and garden and her small produce business, and in the evenings they came together as a family, sharing meals and stories and the quiet contentment of lives well lived. Hugh Morrison died peacefully in his sleep in early November, his heart simply stopping after 7 decades of faithful service. The whole town mourned him, but none more than Caleb, who'd found in the old smith not just a teacher, but a father figure who'd believed in him when he needed it most. The funeral was well attended, and Reverend Whitaker spoke eloquently about Hugh's contributions to the community and his generous spirit. "He gave me everything," Caleb said to Ruth the night after the funeral, holding Emma close like she could anchor him through the grief. "Not just the forge, but the belief that I belonged here, that I could build something lasting." "And you have," Ruth said. "Look around, Caleb. Look at what you've built. The bell tower, the school gate, a dozen other projects around town. This family, this life. Hugh saw your potential, but you did the work. That's all you." Hugh's niece, true to his prediction, offered to sell Caleb the forge property at a fair price. It took some creative financing and a loan from the town bank, but by December, Caleb owned the forge outright. His name went up on the sign, Thorne Iron Works, and he felt the weight and pride of ownership settle on his shoulders like a mantle. Their second Christmas as a married couple was vastly different from the first. Emma was 7 months old, sitting up on her own and fascinated by everything. They decorated the cottage with pine boughs and candles, and on Christmas morning, Emma was more interested in the wrapping paper than the wooden rattle Caleb had carved for her. They laughed at her delight, took turns holding her, and marveled at how much their lives had changed in 2 short years. From rejected mail-order husband to successful blacksmith husband and father, Ruth said as they sat by the fire on Christmas evening, Emma drowsy in her arms. "That's quite a transformation." "From lonely widow to beloved wife and mother," Caleb countered. "Your transformation is just as remarkable." "We transformed together," Ruth said. "That's what makes it work. We didn't just find each other. We became better versions of ourselves because of each other." It was true. Caleb was no longer the man who'd stepped off that train, shoulders hunched and spirit broken, convinced his height made him unlovable. He stood straight now, unashamed of the space he occupied, secure in the knowledge that he was valued for who he was rather than despite it. Ruth, too, had transformed from a woman hiding her scars and her heart into someone confident and open, willing to be vulnerable because she knew that vulnerability would be met with care. As winter settled over Willow Bend and the new year approached, the Thornes looked toward the future with hope and confidence. There would be challenges, certainly. There always were. Money would occasionally be tight. Emma would grow up and face difficulties of her own. The world would throw obstacles in their path that they couldn't yet foresee, but they'd face it all together, 2 people who'd been broken and rejected and told they were too much or not enough, who'd found in each other exactly what they needed. They'd built a life from nothing but hope and hard work and stubborn determination to prove wrong everyone who'd doubted them. And they'd keep building, keep growing, keep making space for love and joy and all the messy, wonderful complications of being human. On a cold January evening, Caleb stood in his workshop putting the finishing touches on a project he'd been working on for weeks. It was a bench, specially designed with one side higher than the other, the proportions carefully calculated so that when Ruth sat on the low side and he sat on the high side, their shoulders would be level. He'd carved their names into the wood, along with Emma's, and a space left blank for any children who might come later. He'd made it from the strongest wood he could find, built to last generations, a physical representation of what they'd created together. Ruth came out to the workshop, Emma bundled against the cold, and stopped when she saw the bench. "Caleb," she breathed, "it's beautiful." "It's for us," he said, "for our family. I'm going to put it in front of the cottage, where we can sit and watch Emma play, and watch the town go by, and just be together." Ruth ran her hand along the smooth wood, her scarred fingers tracing the carved names. When she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with tears. "Do you remember what I told you that first day we really talked? That you looked like someone who listens more than he speaks." "I remember," Caleb said. "I was right about that, but I missed the more important truth. You're someone who builds what others only dream about. You build towers and gates and benches that last. But more than that, you build connections. You build community. You built us. This family, this life, this love that doesn't ask anyone to be smaller or quieter or less than they are." She stepped close, Emma between them, and Caleb wrapped his arms around both of them. Through the workshop window, he could see Willow Bend settling in for the night, lamps glowing in windows, smoke rising from chimneys, the bell tower he'd built standing silent, watch over it all. "Margaret Whitmore was right about one thing," Ruth said softly. "You are a giant, but not in the way she meant it. You're a giant in all the ways that matter, in kindness and strength of character, in the capacity to love and be loved. You're a giant among men, Caleb Thorne, and I'm grateful every day that you're mine." Caleb bent down, that familiar distance that had once felt like a burden but now felt like coming home, and kissed his wife while their daughter gurgled happily between them. The workshop was cold and the winter was long, but inside the circle of their family, everything was warm and right and exactly as it should be. He'd come to Willow Bend broken and rejected, convinced he was too much for anyone to love. He'd found Ruth, who showed him that being too much was just another way of saying enough. Together they'd built something that couldn't be measured in feet and inches, something that had nothing to do with proportion or propriety or anyone else's narrow definitions of acceptable. They'd built a life, a real life, the kind worth living, worth fighting for, worth celebrating in all its messy, beautiful, complicated glory. And that, Caleb thought as he held his family close, was the greatest thing he'd ever made, greater than any tower or gate or carefully crafted ironwork. This love, this family, this home where everyone fit exactly as they were. In Willow Bend, people still told the story of the mail-order husband who'd been rejected for being too tall. But they told it differently now, with the ending he'd written himself. Not a story of rejection, but of redemption. Not about being found wanting, but about being found worthy. Not about a man who was too much, but about a man who was finally, gloriously, exactly enough.